Making habits, breaking habits. Why we do things, why we don't, and how to make any change stick. By Jeremy Dean. Narrated by Sean Pratt. Part 1. Anatomy of a Habit. Chapter 1. Birth of a Habit. This book started with an apparently simple question that seemed to have a simple answer. How long does it take to form a new habit? Say you want to go to the gym regularly, eat more fruit, learn a new language, make new friends, practice a musical instrument, or achieve anything that requires regular application of effort over time. How long should it take before it becomes a part of your routine rather than something you have to force yourself to do? I looked for an answer the same way most people do nowadays. I asked Google. This research suggested the answer was clear-cut. Most top results made reference to a magic figure of 21 days. These websites maintained that research, and the scare quotes are fully justified, had found that if you repeated a behavior every day for 21 days, then you would have established a brand new habit. There wasn't much discussion of what type of behavior it was or the circumstances you had to repeat it in, just this figure of 21 days. Exercise, smoking, writing a diary, or turning cartwheels, you name it, 21 days is the answer. In addition, many authors recommend that it's crucial to maintain a chain of 21 days without breaking it. But where does this number come from? Since I'm a psychologist with research training, I'm used to seeing references that would support a bold statement like that. There were none. My search turned to the library. There, I discovered a variety of stories going around about the source of the number. Easily my favorite concerns a plastic surgeon, Maxwell Maltz, M.D. Dr. Maltz published a book in 1960 called Psycho-Cybernetics, in which he noted that amputees took, on average, 21 days to adjust to the loss of a limb, and he argued that people take 21 days to adjust to any major life changes. He also wrote that he saw the same pattern in those whose faces he had operated on. He found that it took about 21 days for their self-esteem either to rise to meet their newly created beauty or stay at its old level. The figure of 21 days has exercised an enormous power over self-help authors ever since. Bookshops are filled with titles like Millionaire Habits in 21 Days, 21 Days to a Thrifty Lifestyle, 21 Days to Eating Better, and finally the most optimistic of all, 21-Day Challenge, change almost anything in 21 days. At least it acknowledges that it might be a challenge. Occasionally, the 21-day period is deemed a little too optimistic, and we are given an extra week to transform ourselves. These more generous titles include 28-Day Vitality Plan and Diet Rehab, 28 Days to Finally Stop Craving the Foods That Made You Fat. Whether 21 or 28 days, it's clear that what we eat, how we spend money, or indeed anything else we do, has little in common with losing a leg or having plastic surgery. To take Dr. Maltz's observations of his patients and generalize them to almost all human behavior is optimistic at best. It's even more optimistic when you consider the variety amongst habits. Driving to work, avoiding the cracks in the pavement, thinking about sports, walking the dog, eating a salad, booking a flight to China. They could all be habits, and yet they involve such different areas of our lives. But to be fair, Maltz didn't invent the 21-day time frame. There are all sorts of origin stories explaining its whereabouts, most of them standing on science-free ground. Thanks to recent research, though, we now have some idea of how long common habits really take to form. In a study carried out at University College London, 96 participants were asked to choose an everyday behavior that they wanted to turn into a habit. They all chose something they didn't already do that could be repeated every day. Many were health-related. People chose things like eating a piece of fruit with lunch and running for 15 minutes after dinner. Each of the 84 days of the study, they logged into a website and reported whether or not they'd carried out the behavior, as well as how automatic the behavior had felt. As we'll soon see, acting without thinking, or automaticity, is a central component of a habit. So, here's the big question. How long did it take to form a habit? The simple answer is that on average, across the participants who provided enough data, it took 66 days until a habit was formed. And contrary to what's commonly believed, missing a day or two doesn't much affect habit formation. The complicated answer is more interesting, though. Otherwise, this would be a short book. As you might imagine, there was considerable variation in how long habits took to form depending on what people tried to do. People who resolved to drink a glass of water after breakfast were up to maximum automaticity after 20 days, while those trying to eat a piece of fruit with lunch took at least twice as long to turn it into a habit. The exercise habit proved most tricky, with 50 sit-ups after morning coffee still not a habit after 84 days for one participant. Walking for 10 minutes after breakfast, though, was turned into a habit after 50 days for another participant. In the graph they made from the study, it was found that there was a curved relationship between repeating a habit and automaticity. This means that the earlier repetitions produced the greatest gains toward establishing a habit. As time went on, these gains were smaller. It's like trying to run up a hill that starts out steep and gradually levels off. At the start, you're making great progress upwards, but the closer you get to the peak, the smaller the gains in altitude with each step. For a minority of participants, though, the new habits did not come naturally. Indeed, overall, the researchers were surprised by how slowly habits seemed to form. Although the study only covered 84 days, by extrapolating the curves, it turned out that some of the habits could have taken around 254 days to form, the better part of a year. What this research suggests is that 21 days to form a habit is probably right, as long as all you want to do is drink a glass of water after breakfast. Anything harder is likely to take longer to become a really strong habit, and in the case of some activities, much longer. Dr. Malt and his cheerleaders weren't even close, and all those books promising habit change in only a few weeks are grossly optimistic. Of course, this study opens up a whole new set of questions. The participants were only trying to adopt new habits. What about our existing habits? How much better might they have done using tried and tested psychological techniques? And this study doesn't really tell us what a habit feels like, how we experience it, or where it tends to happen. What do we actually do all day long? Some busy days slip by in a flash, and we remember little. Whether at work or idling around at home, it would be fascinating to know exactly how our time is spent and which parts are habitual. Unfortunately, there's a very good reason why we tend to be awful at recalling habitual behavior, which is to do with its automaticity. So psychologists use diary studies, which give a much more accurate picture of what people are up to than we can get from memory. In one study led by habit researcher Wendy Wood, 70 undergraduates at Texas A&M University were given a watch alarm. Every hour, while they were awake, it reminded them to write down what they were doing, thinking, and feeling right at that very moment. The idea was not just to build up a list of activities, but to see the context in which they occurred. Across two separate studies, the researchers found that somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 the time, people were engaged in behaviors that were rated as habitual. This suggests that as much as half the time we're awake, we're performing a habit of one kind or another. Even this high figure may well be an underestimate, since it's based on only young people whose habits haven't had much of a chance to set hard. So what were participants in Wood's research up to? Since they were students, the largest category was studying. This included attending classes, reading, and going to the library, which made up 32% of the diary entries. Amongst these activities, about 1/3 were classified as habitual. The next category was entertainment, which participants were engaged in 14% of the time. This included things like watching TV, using the internet, and listening to music. And this time, the percentage of habitual activities went up to 54%. Next on the list were social interactions, which made up 10% of the entries, and 47% of which were classified as habitual behaviors. The category in which the behaviors were least habitual was cleaning, down at only 21%, while the category which was most habitual was going to sleep and waking up at 81%. At least they weren't hiding their lazy, slovenly ways. More important than precisely what they were doing, especially for those of us who aren't students, are the characteristics of habits. What does it feel like? What's going on in our minds? What emerged from this study, as it has from others, are three main characteristics of a habit. The first is that we're only vaguely aware of performing them. Like when you drive to work and don't notice the traffic lights. You know some part of your mind was attending to them, along with other road users and the speed limit, but you often can't specifically remember doing so. In Wood's study, participants reported exactly this vagueness about their habitual behavior. While they were hanging out, watching TV, or brushing their teeth, they reported thinking about what they were doing only 40% of the time. It's one of the major benefits of a habit. It allows us to zone out and think about something else, like planning a trip on the weekend. Habits allow the conscious part of our minds to go a-wandering while our unconscious gets on with those tedious, repetitious behaviors. Habits help protect us from decision fatigue, the fact that the mere act of making decisions depletes our mental energy. Whatever can be done automatically frees up our processing power for other thoughts. A habit doesn't just fly under the radar cognitively, it also does so emotionally. And this is the second characteristic that emerged. The act of performing a habit is curiously emotionless. The reason is that habits, through their repetition, lose their emotional flavor. Like anything in life, as we become habituated, our emotional response lessens. The emotion researcher Nico Frida classifies this as one of the laws of emotion, and it applies to both pleasure and pain. Activities we once considered painful, like getting up early to go to work, become less so with repetition. On the other hand, activities which excite or give us pleasure initially, like sex, beer, or listening to Beethoven's Seventh, soon become mundane. Of course, we fight against the leaking away of pleasure, sometimes with success, by seeking variety. This is why some people feel they have to keep pushing the boundaries of experience just to get the same high. None of this means we don't feel emotion while performing a habit. It's just that the feelings we experience usually have less to do with the habit and more to do with where our minds have wandered off. Wood's research found this exact pattern in participants' reports of their emotional experience. Compared with non-habitual behaviors, when people were performing habits, their emotions tended not to change. In addition, the emotions that people did experience were less likely to be related to what they were doing than when their activities were non-habitual. The fact that habitual behavior doesn't stir up strong emotions is one of its advantages. Participants in this study felt more in control and less stressed while performing habits than they did enacting non-habitual behaviors. The moment that participants switched to non-habitual behaviors, their stress level increased. The third important characteristic of a habit is so obvious that we often don't notice it. Perhaps this is partly a result of the automatic nature of habits. Take some typical daily routines. You get up in the morning, go to the bathroom, and take a shower. Later, you're in the car when you turn on your favorite radio station. Then at the coffee shop, you order a blueberry muffin. The connection is context. We tend to do the same things in the same circumstances. Indeed, it's partly this correspondence between the situation and behavior that causes habits to form in the first place. The idea that we create associations between our environment and certain behaviors was memorably demonstrated by the Russian psychologist Ivan Pavlov. In Pavlov's most famous research carried out on dogs, he created an association between being fed and ringing a bell. Then after a while, he tried ringing the bell without feeding the dog. He noticed that the dog began to salivate anyway. The bathroom, car, and coffee shop are like Pavlov's bell, unconsciously reminding us of long-standing patterns of behavior, which we then enact again in exactly the same way as before. This is backed up by research on humans that shows that people tend to perform the same actions in the same contexts. In the diary study described above, most of the behaviors like socializing, washing, and reading are carried out in the same place. It becomes clear just how much context is important for habit whenever you move house or get a new job. Once in the new home, it's suddenly difficult to do the simplest of jobs. Making a sandwich becomes an ordeal as you have to consciously think about where the knives and plates are. It's not just simple tasks that become more difficult, it's all your usual routines. From getting up in the morning to going to bed at night, so many tasks feel like they're being done for the first time. You may even find yourself trying to carry out your old habits in your new home, to no avail. Because everything is moved, suddenly those ingrained ways of behaving fail you. The same goes for new jobs. Where once you glided around the workplace on autopilot from one task to the next, in the new job you feel like a fish out of water. Psychologists have seen how important context is in research on how people cope with changes to their environment. In one study, students' habits were tracked as they transferred to a new university. They were asked how often they watched TV, read the paper, and exercised, both before the move and afterwards. They were also asked about the context in which these habitual behaviors were performed. How did they perceive the context? Where were they physically? And who was with them at the time? The answers to these questions built a picture of whether the context had really changed with the move from one location to another. For example, it's possible that although a physical location changes, the overall context doesn't. Like hotel rooms, one dorm room can look much like another, so it might not feel that things have changed much. What the participants reported as they moved from one university to another was that context was important in habit change. They found that if they wanted to cut down their TV and increase their exercise, it was easier to do so after the move. This is because new surroundings don't have all the familiar cues to our old habits. Without those cues, our autopilot doesn't run so smoothly and our conscious mind keeps asking us what to do. That's why moving house is like going on holiday. Without your established routines, you have to keep consciously thinking about what you're going to do now. The same thing happened to these students. Instead of automatically watching TV or reading the newspaper, they were more likely to think, what did I plan to do today? And what do I actually want to do now? As a consequence, a world of possibility opens up. The rather bland word context can also include other people. Whether we notice it or not, we are heavily influenced by those around us. The researchers in this study found that participants' behavior was disrupted by any changes in the behavior of those around them. For example, students reported they changed their newspaper reading habits if those around them changed theirs. It isn't necessarily the case that we copy other people, just that they tend to cause some change in us. This ties in with the finding that people who live alone report more of their daily behaviors as being habitual than those who live with others. Other people then disrupt our routines, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse. Now, we've seen how habits are born, what they feel like, and how much of our daily lives they take up. 3 characteristics have emerged. Firstly, we perform habits automatically without much conscious deliberation. Secondly, habitual behaviors provoke little emotional response by themselves. Thirdly, habits are strongly rooted in the situations in which they occur. We also know that they can vary considerably in how long they take to form. But how much control do we have over our habits? If we want to make a change, how easy will it be? Chapter 2. Habit versus intention. An unfair fight. We like to think that our habits follow our intentions. If I want to form a habit, I should be able to. Say I decide to switch from white to whole wheat bread. I buy it from the store a few weeks in a row. I like it, so I keep getting it. With each repetition, the habit gets a little stronger, and after a few months, I'm picking it up off the shelf without even thinking. I intended to eat more healthily, and now I am. Just the same sort of process, with our intentions flowing into our habits, goes on in all sorts of areas of life. Learning to ride a bike, dance, or cook. Individual physical actions are built up over time into chains of behavior we perform automatically. Mental habits can be built up in just the same way, again with intentions flowing into habitual ways of thinking. You might decide you're being too harsh on a friend, say, by always thinking they are selfish. You make a mental note to spot a more benevolent trend in their behavior. You notice when they buy you a drink and listen to your problems. Small things, but steps in the right direction. Sure enough, you start to think of them as less selfish. Unconsciously, the habitual ways in which you think about your friend have changed. Our mental habits can change in this way because our minds are so good at spotting patterns. Indeed, it's one of the mind's chief functions. Our ability to spot patterns at low levels and build them up into a habit based on our conscious intentions enables us to reach much more complex goals. Here's an example from a classic psychology study. Participants sat in front of a computer for almost an hour, pressing one of 4 buttons corresponding to where a cross appeared on the screen. Naturally, it was very boring. But the experimenters had a little trick up their sleeve. Unknown to the participants, there was a pattern in where the crosses appeared. Despite being consciously undetectable, the participants began to respond faster as the study went on. They were learning the pattern. When interviewed afterwards, though, none had noticed anything. They had learnt it without realizing. This is a study about unconscious learning, but it demonstrates how mental habits can grow out of patterns. Here, an unconscious learning process was in the service of a higher level intention, to do well on the test and please the experimenters. When you learn to shoot a basketball through a hoop or reverse a car into a tight space, it's the physical equivalent of this unconscious mental learning process. Lots of small unconscious actions are built up to achieve one big conscious goal, shooting a hoop or parking a car. In the mental realm, mathematics is an early example of this building up process. At school, we learn a series of operations we can perform on numbers to reach a goal. Say, working out the average height of our classmates. Although learning these basic operations, addition and division, can be excruciating for young minds, they soon become second nature. Later on, we can perform them almost without conscious thought, which enables us to complete much more complex calculations. Once again, the habit of particular mental or physical operations helps us achieve a whole series of higher-order goals. We all have an intuitive sense that our habits are built up purely in the service of our goals. Remember that bad habits are also goal-oriented, although the goal may not be a good one, like getting drunk to forget one's problems. Indeed, the stronger people's habits, the more they believe that those habits are goal-oriented. Our intuitive sense that intentions lead straight into habits is far from just a lay understanding. Many influential psychologists have expressed exactly the same idea. Generations of first-year undergraduate psychologists are taught that intentions are a major key to predicting behavior. They learned theories with grand-sounding names like the model of interpersonal behavior, the theory of planned behavior, and the theory of reasoned action, which all suggest that when we form an intention, it leads us to act in line with that intention. These are influential ideas across different sub-disciplines of psychology, and they underpin much research. Now these theories are being challenged because, like our intuitive understanding, they don't tell the full story. We may like to think our intentions flow directly into our habits, but often they don't. It's an idea we resist because it strikes at our sense of having free will. We like to think that things happen for a reason, and one of those reasons is because we decided it would happen, or, at the very least, that someone else decided it would happen. Yet habits don't flow solely from our intentions, and there are studies that demonstrate this. Worse for our sense of agency, it's possible for intention and habit to be completely reversed. Sometimes we unconsciously infer our intentions from our habits. How the habit started in the first place could be a complete accident. But we can then work out our intentions from our behavior as long as there's no strong reason for that behavior. Say, I take a walk around the park every afternoon, and each time I follow a particular route which takes me past a duck pond. When asked why I take this route, I might reply that I like to watch people feeding the ducks. In reality, I just walked that way the first time, completely at random, and saw no reason not to do the same the next day. Now, after the habit is established, I try to come up with a reason, and the ducks spring to mind. I end up inferring intention from what was essentially just chance. We know people regularly do this sort of backwards thinking and really believe it. One of the most famous examples in psychological research is cognitive dissonance. This is the idea that people don't like to hold two inconsistent ideas to be true at the same time. Studies conducted more than half a century ago find that when people are induced into behavior that is inconsistent with their beliefs, they simply change their beliefs to match. It's like when someone ends up spending too much on a new car. Instead of feeling bad about the clash between their original plan and what they've actually done, they prefer to convince themselves that the car is worth the extra money. This is a result of our natural desire to maintain consistency between our thoughts and actions. We all want to be right, and one thing we should all be able to be right about is ourselves. Backwards thinking allows us to do just that. But surely we would know if we were doing this kind of backwards thinking. Unfortunately, though, we have little access to these sorts of unconscious processes. It turns out that in experiment after experiment, psychologists can change minds without participants realizing. In one study on attitudes, people clearly changed their mind on an issue after being bombarded with reasons to do so. Despite this, they claimed the arguments had had no effect on them. Indeed, they thought their new attitudes were what they had always thought. It seems politicians aren't alone in blanking out their U-turns. Like it or not, we're all capable of it. What we've explored so far are two extremes: when we create habits intentionally for a particular purpose, and when we infer intentions from our behavior. In real life, though, both of these processes happen at the same time, and habit is a combination of our intentions and our past behavior. So here's the crucial question: what kind of combination? Can the intention to start eating healthily or get a new job really overcome the habit of eating junk food and going to the same office every day? We already know quite a lot about this question because psychologists are very keen to change people's behavior, hopefully for the better. Studies on donating blood, exercising, recycling, and voting have all examined whether it's possible to change people's habits. One of these tested if participants could predict their own consumption of fast food, how much they watched TV news, and how often they rode the bus over a week. Each person was asked how much they intended to carry out each of those three behaviors over the coming week. Then, They were asked how often they had performed each behavior in the past. These are the measures of intention and habit. Over the next 7 days, participants noted down how often they went into a fast food restaurant, watched TV news, and rode the bus. The results showed that when established habits were weak, intentions tended to predict behavior. So, if you didn't watch TV news that much, your intention for the coming week, whether it's to watch more, less, or the same, is likely to be accurate. Good news for our sense of self-control. But here comes the bad news. As habits get stronger, our intentions predict our behavior less and less. So when you're in the habit of visiting fast food restaurants, for example, it doesn't matter much whether you intend to cut it down or not. Chances are that your habit will continue. It gets worse, though. Participants were also asked how confident they were in predicting their behavior over the coming 7 days. An unusual result emerged. Those with the strongest habits, who were the least successful in predicting their behavior over the coming week, were the most confident in their predictions. The finding is striking because it hints at one of the dark sides of habits. When we perform an action repeatedly, its familiarity seems to bleed back into our judgments about that behavior. We end up feeling we have more control over precisely the behaviors that, in reality, we have the least control over. It's another example of our thought processes working in the opposite way to our intuitive expectations. Considering how powerful habits are in the face of conscious intentions, it is vital to know what a strong habit is compared with a weak habit. For example, is buying a pair of shoes once a month a habit? What about reading the newspaper every day or attending a community meeting twice a year? How often before we find it increasingly difficult to stop ourselves? Or, put the other way around, no longer have to force ourselves? Psychologists have looked at this in a review of 60 different research reports on habitual behavior. They classified habits into 2 categories. In the first, they put things like exercising, coffee drinking, and using a seatbelt. The kinds of things that you might do at least once a week. In the second category, they put the kinds of things we might only do a few times a year. They included things like donating blood or getting flu shots, but could just as easily include going to the dentist or getting a haircut. The other important thing they took into account was the context in which each repeated action took place. Context is a vital component of habitual behavior because we tend to perform the same actions in response to particular situations. Across all the studies, intentions emerged as the strongest predictor of future behavior. Overall, people were doing what they intended. Yet when habits were divided up into either those performed about weekly or those performed approximately yearly, a big difference emerged. Once again, when behaviors were performed weekly, established habits tended to rule people's behavior in comparison to any plans they'd formed to act differently. It was only when behaviors were performed only once or a few times a year, like getting flu shots or donating blood, that intentions took over from autopilot. Once again, the situation was also important since habitual behaviors performed in stable situations, like always ordering a latte in a coffee shop, are even less susceptible to our intentions. This suggests that the difference between a strong and a weak habit is somewhere in the region of whether it is performed weekly or only a few times a year. This means strong habits could encompass an enormous amount of our behavior. If you think about the things you might do on a weekly basis in the same context, say visiting a restaurant or watching a film, it feels like these decisions are highly intentional. But this research would suggest these types of behaviors are close in nature to daily actions like wearing a seatbelt, catching up on the news, or checking your email. We have less intentional conscious control over these types of behaviors than we would like to think. For years, psychologists have tried changing people's bad habits by targeting their intentions. Hundreds of studies have attempted to help people adopt a low-fat diet, do more exercise, wear a bicycle helmet, use a condom, take a college course, quit smoking, put on sunscreen, and many, many more laudable causes. When the results are added up together, they don't look too clever. One review of 47 of the most rigorous of these studies produced sobering reading. On the positive side, psychologists are very successful at getting people to change their goals and intentions. After various psychological techniques have been used on them, people in these studies definitely want and intend to change. Unfortunately, the problem comes with breaking down existing habits. Although people intend to change, when habits are strong, actual behavior change is relatively low. Despite all this talk of how weak intentions are in the face of habits, it's worth emphasizing that much of the time, even our strong habits do follow our intentions. We are mostly doing what we intend to do, even though it's happening automatically. When washing our face each day, picking up an espresso on the way to work, or cleaning our glasses, it's because at some point in the past we consciously decided, or someone decided for us, that these things were worthwhile activities. So we kept repeating them until they were automatic. This probably goes for many habits. Although we perform them without bringing the intention to consciousness, the habits still line up with our original intentions. Even better, our automatic unconscious habits can keep us safe even when our conscious mind is distracted. We look both ways before crossing the road, despite reminiscing about a rather depressing holiday we took in Brazil. And we put oven gloves on before reaching into the oven, despite being preoccupied about whether the Brussels sprouts are overcooked. In both cases, our goal of keeping ourselves alive and unburnt is served by our automatic, unconscious habits. It's only for the minority of bad habits that we want to change that things become tricky. There's no doubt that there are plenty of occasions when we can successfully make or break our habits. Still, what we find from the research on habits and intention is that our conscious decisions aren't as strong as we'd like to think. In some ways, this is a comforting thought. It means that all those times we tried to change our behavior and failed because old habits intervened, there was a good reason: the sheer power of strong habits. Studies show that it's normal for strong habits to override our conscious intentions. Combine that with how long habits take to form, and it's no wonder we find our everyday behaviors difficult to change. So why do our habits not submit to our intentions? To answer that question, we have to take a trip into the deep, dark, mysterious world of the unconscious, where the secrets of how our habits operate are buried. Chapter 3. Your Secret Autopilot. Imagine you're at a friend's house party. There are quite a few new faces, so you're scanning the room. Then your gaze lands on an attractive stranger on the other side of the room. You look away. You look back. The first hint of a smile plays across their lips. Suddenly you're nervous. Your mind goes blank. You want to go over and you want to run away, both at the same time. You turn around too fast, bump into someone, almost spilling your drink. Then you take a few deep breaths, compose yourself, and pretend to be looking around for someone you know while you try to track down the attractive stranger. There they are, over there, half concealed by a lamp. A friend taps you on the arm to ask who you're looking at. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you think you'd be able to describe accurately why you find this person attractive? Indeed, how good are we in general at pinpointing what it is about others that attracts us? Before you answer, consider a sneaky study carried out by Swedish psychologists. People are shown pairs of female faces on playing card-sized photos, one in each of the experimenters' hands. They pointed to whichever of the two faces they found more attractive. The experimenter then passed the card to the participants and asked them to describe exactly why they found that face attractive. But this is a psychology experiment, so there's a twist in the tale. Sometimes, when the experimenter passed the card to participants, there was a little sleight of hand involved. This resulted in half the participants staring at the female face they didn't choose. So half the participants were being asked to justify a decision that, in reality, they hadn't made. A few spotted the trick, but most didn't. They were then asked to describe exactly why they had chosen that face. Think about what you'd expect to get. If the face was second best for you, then wouldn't your enthusiasm at least be dampened? Perhaps the information would be processed unconsciously, leading to a subtle difference in your report. For example, we might be more uncertain or more vague about why we preferred this face. But analyzing the participants' reports, the researchers couldn't find any difference between the two groups. Both the participants looking at the photo they chose and those looking at the one they didn't seemed sure of their reasons, were equally specific, and expressed equal levels of emotionality. The verbal reports gave no clue the switch had been performed. The researchers then gave this phenomena a snappy new name: choice blindness. This then is the idea that under certain circumstances we are actually oblivious to the choice we have made. To take you back to the opening scene, how sure are you now that you'd be able to accurately describe what it was you saw in that attractive stranger? Hopefully, if you were sure before, you're slightly less sure now. What this study hints at is the strange nature of the unconscious, which is central to an understanding of how our habits work, the way they do, and what we can do to change them. For thousands of years, humans have been trying to make sense of what's going on in our own minds. One of the most famous voyagers in the inner self was the psychoanalytic pioneer Sigmund Freud. Although nowadays he doesn't enjoy the same scientific prominence, his ideas about the unconscious have taken hold of the popular imagination. So much so that we tend to think it's possible to reach down into our unconscious and find out about ourselves. The process of psychoanalysis, Freud liked to explain, was not unlike that of an archaeological dig. While it can be difficult to unearth the truth about yourself, it is nevertheless there, buried deep down below layers of neuroses and complexes and other strange motivations and desires. Many modern psychologists take quite a different view of the unconscious. It is best articulated by Timothy D. Wilson of the University of Virginia, who has long been interested in what we do, and frequently don't, know about ourselves. Over the years, Wilson and others have sent thousands of participants off on these archaeological digs into the unconscious mind to see what comes up. In one study, researchers set themselves up in a mall, pretending to carry out a consumer survey on nightgowns and nylon stockings. Passers-by were asked to evaluate what they were told were 4 different nightgowns and 4 different pairs of stockings. In fact, all 4 items were identical. Quite by accident, they discovered that people seemed to prefer the item that was on the far right, and this was most pronounced for the stockings. The rightmost pair, although identical to the leftmost, was preferred by a factor of 4 to 1. But did people notice that it was because they were on the right? Could they dig down and work out what was going on? Apparently not. When asked why they had chosen a particular item, no one mentioned its position. Even when the experimenter suggested that the position might have an effect, most participants looked at best very confused and at worst utterly dismissive. So people didn't have a clue why they preferred one identical pair of stockings over another. Score 1 for the unconscious and 0 for the conscious. Another of Wilson's studies looked at the inverse situation, when people think something will unconsciously influence them when actually it doesn't. In this study, participants read a passage from the novel Rabbit Run by John Updike. The extract from the book involves an emotionally charged scene in which an alcoholic mother, while washing her baby in the bath, accidentally drowns her. The participants were split into 4 groups, who were presented with different versions of the passage. In one group, the scene was presented in its entirety. In the second group, a part of the scene, a description of the baby's messy crib, was deleted. For the third group, a different part of the scene, a physical description of the baby, was deleted. And in the fourth group, both the description of the baby's messy crib and the physical description of the baby were deleted. Afterwards, participants rated the emotional impact of whichever passage they had read on a simple scale from 1 to 7. Then, participants in condition 2, 3, or 4 were shown the deleted scenes and asked if it would have made any difference to the emotional impact of the whole extract if they had been included. On average, most of the participants thought the deleted parts would have increased the emotional impact. But when the researchers looked at the ratings, it was clear that the emotional impact was unaffected by deleting either or both of these sections. So here we have people thinking something will unconsciously affect them when, in fact, it made no measurable difference at all. Score 2 for the unconscious and 0 for the conscious. Now the examples get more personal and even slightly uncomfortable. You might well think it isn't that big a deal that you don't know why you choose particular products or can't accurately predict the emotional impact of literary works. These are not that important. So let's come a little closer to home. Let's talk about personality, attitudes, and self-esteem. These are 3 things about ourselves that we should be able to judge accurately. Once again, we find shocking deficits in our self-knowledge. Take the case of shyness. One study compared people's self-reports about their shyness with an implicit test of shyness, that is, by seeing what they do in a real situation, rather than what they say they do. Now, of course, there is some overlap between self-reports and implicit tests. People who are raging extroverts don't report being really shy. But what this study finds is that there is not as much overlap as we would expect. We seem to know something about our own personalities, but not as much as we'd like to think. Attitudes are great examples of where people say one thing, but their actions reveal something else. We all know people who secretly watch TV shows that they would never publicly admit to liking. The most incendiary example is race, where people claim they're not racist, but their behavior suggests otherwise. It is possible people are trying to keep unsavory attitudes quiet, but the research suggests people are actually successfully hiding it from themselves. Perhaps the most incredible example is self-esteem. Surely we know how high our own self-esteem is. Well, psychologists have used sneaky methods of measuring self-esteem indirectly, and then compare them with what we explicitly say. For example, one study put participants through a 5-minute interview designed to make them feel their personality was being probed. They were asked the types of questions that psychologists stereotypically are supposed to ask, like, if you could be any sort of animal, what animal would that be and why? This was a smokescreen. In fact, they wanted to see how much nervous body language participants exhibited. This was the real measure of self-esteem. What they found was only a very weak connection between how high they thought their self-esteem was and how much nervous body language they displayed. It seems almost unbelievable that we aren't aware of how high our own self-esteem is, since it's such an integral part of ourselves. Amazingly, some studies find almost no connection at all. It's like you ask someone what color their eyes are and where they were born, and the best they can do is darkish and somewhere in the northern hemisphere. There's even some evidence that the more we try to think about our self-esteem, the less accurate we become. Once again, with self-esteem, as with the other aspects of self-knowledge, we are strangers to ourselves. The fact that our unconscious doesn't completely control us is mostly down to our frontal lobes, the part of the brain that sits just above our eyes. This area is most associated with all the higher functions like reasoning, memory, and planning, but it also works to monitor and inhibit our actions. When this area of the brain is damaged, control over habits can be lost. The French neurologist François Lermite was the first to systematically document a type of disorder he called utilization behavior. The patients he described all had damage to the frontal lobes of the brain. Some had Alzheimer's disease, others had had surgery for cancer, and some treatment for aneurysms. What Lermite noticed was that many of these patients exhibited a similar type of behavior. When a pair of glasses was put on the table in front of them, they would reach out, pick them up, and put them on. Nothing odd in that, you might say. Except when another pair of glasses was put on the table, they would pick up those and put them on over the first pair. And with another pair, they would repeat the same action. Patients with utilization behavior show this pattern for all sorts of habitual actions and without any internal motivation. If a glass of water is placed in front of them, they drink it, although they are not thirsty. If food is brought, they start to eat it despite just having had lunch. If a comb is set down on the table, they pick it up and use it, although their hair is perfectly tidy. What's even more strange is that they will perform all these actions after being specifically told not to. When asked why they drank from the water despite not being thirsty and being told not to touch the water, they simply replied, "Because you held out the objects to me and I thought I had to grasp and use them." Then sometimes they would sit there asking themselves, "Must I use them?" This utilization behavior only seems to happen when the patients already have an established habit. For those who don't smoke, cigarettes and a lighter provoke no automatic behavior. But if the experimenter reaches for the pack and takes a cigarette, the patient will light it for them. At the other extreme are patients who seem only too aware of how their habits are being unconsciously cued. One example is known as alien hand syndrome. Here, patients find their hand performs all kinds of actions that they don't want it to. Like those with utilization behavior, they will reach out and grab glasses of water, doorknobs, or clothing despite having no conscious desire for water, going through doors, or undressing. Their experience is one of complete detachment from the alien hand, as though someone else were operating it. The syndrome was used to great comic effect by Stanley Kubrick in his 1964 film Dr. Strangelove, in which the eponymous doctor, played by Peter Sellers, can't keep his alien hand under control. Away from the movies, though, patients with this problem find it very distressing, as they really experience the hand as though it is being externally controlled. This is a glimpse into two frightening worlds in which unconscious habits take complete control over the physical body. One without the patient realizing, and another, more distressingly, with full conscious awareness. Fortunately for most of us, these extremes of behavior are only something we can try to understand from the outside. Although they're severe examples, they do demonstrate how our habits are continually bubbling up from the unconscious. When we see glasses of water, doorknobs, or plates of food, somewhere deep in our unconscious, automatic processes are being initiated. The fact that we don't always perform these habits is down to other inhibitory processes, which try to stop us eating and drinking when we're not hungry or thirsty, and opening doors when we don't want to leave rooms. The unconscious mind is carrying out all sorts of high-level thinking which we don't have access to, try as we might. This includes basic perceptual and motor processes that we'd expect, like how to catch a ball, recognize the face of a loved one, or reverse a car into a tight spot. Generally, it's not too worrying that there are things our bodies know that our conscious minds don't. Less intuitively and less happily for our own sense of self, we find that we have little access to the kinds of thinking processes that should be transparent, such as our own attitudes, our personality, and our self-esteem. Over the years and over many hundreds of studies, a new view of the unconscious has emerged, a view that diverges from Freud's theories in a central way. Freud thought we could dig down through the archaeological layers to get at the truth of why we think and do the things we do. Many modern psychologists think otherwise. Rather than a series of archaeological layers which can carefully be scraped away, the center of our unconscious is more like the Earth's core. We get the results in the form of emotional earthquakes, thought eruptions, and the rest, but the actual causes can be extremely mysterious. That's why sometimes our emotions, attitudes, and decisions can fluctuate for no reason that's accessible to our conscious selves, leaving us floundering. None of this stops us from trying to guess what's going on down there, which we do all the time, and researchers have been fascinated to see what happens when we try. The results are not heartening. In one study, students waiting in line at a college dining hall filled out a questionnaire asking them why they liked their chosen drink. Others just made their choice without thinking twice about their preference. They acted as a control group. Then the researchers peeked in the cups to see how much of each drink they had drunk. What emerged was that participants who had really thought about how much they liked their chosen drink were less accurate in predicting how much they would actually drink than those who hadn't thought about it. In other words, thinking carefully about their preferences lowered people's ability to successfully predict their own behavior. In another study, participants were given a choice between two types of poster to take home, an artistic one or a humorous one. While some were asked to think about the reasons for their choice, others just chose. An interesting thing happened. Trying to work out why they liked the poster made participants more likely to choose the humorous one rather than the artistic one. Then they took them home and reported back after a few weeks about how satisfied they were with their choice. It emerged that those who chose the humorous poster were less satisfied. When the researchers looked more closely at the reasons, they noticed that, on average, people found it easier to come up with reasons to like the humorous poster and, at the same time, to say why they didn't like the art poster. So, because the art poster was more difficult to think about, people chose the humorous poster. But when they got the humorous poster home, it didn't seem quite as funny. What we're seeing here is that people's choices are affected by what thoughts arrive most easily in consciousness, not necessarily what's in the unconscious. On top of this, thinking too hard about the reasons for our decisions can make us less happy with those decisions. This doesn't necessarily mean that introspection always makes us worse predictors of our own behavior or less happy with our choices, but it certainly shows the potential dangers. Still, the typical story of our interaction with our unconscious is frustrating in the extreme. Because we don't have direct access to the reasons we do things, we make up some reasons based on our own personal preferences, theories about the world, and any other available conscious information we can lay our hands on. It's like Aesop's fable about the fox who spots some grapes on a high-hanging branch. He tries to jump and get them, but finds he can't reach. In a flash, he performs a mental U-turn and decides he doesn't want the grapes anymore because they're probably sour. With this U-turn, the fox is protecting himself from the frustration of not being able to get the grapes by telling himself he didn't really want them anyway. This is where we get the phrase, sour grapes. Smokers are doing something similar when telling you they know someone who smoked 40 a day and lived until 100 years of age, or that if the smoking doesn't kill them, something else will. These are rationalizations of the kind our unconscious is spinning all the time, but without our knowledge. The fact that the unconscious is almost impossible to penetrate looks like a problem for anyone who wants to change their habits, since they live mostly in the unconscious part of the mind. Really, though, awareness of the power of the unconscious to guide and change our thinking and behavior is the first step to change. If we deny how much of our thought and behavior is unconscious, we'll have less chance of making changes stick. Probing the unconscious to try and explain our habits is a waste of time. Indeed, it may even be counterproductive. But becoming more aware of our behavior, something we can notice, is very helpful. This is because the habit itself is one of the most important clues as to what is going on in the unconscious. We can use our memories and conscious awareness to piece together a picture of what might be going on down there at our cores. With these clues and an insight into how they are produced by the interaction between what habits we want and what habits we actually get, we can take better control of ourselves. And it's to this interaction that we turn in the next chapter. Chapter 4. Don't think, just do it. The other day I was halfway through watching a film on TV when the power went out. Our wiring isn't the best, so I looked out of the window to check that everyone else's power was out. It was. Then I called the electricity company to complain and was told that engineers had been dispatched. It was dark, so I stumbled about the house using the glow from my mobile phone display. Having found the candles and matches, the apartment was soon lit by a soft glow. I was irritated and confused because I was totally absorbed in the film and suddenly I've been plunged back 2 centuries into a time before electricity in Hollywood. While I was waiting for the power to be restored, I went to the bathroom. As I walked in, my hand went up to the light switch and clicked it on. For a fraction of a second, I stood there confused, wondering why it hadn't had its customary effect. Then I snorted at my own stupidity. Not only have I looked out of the window to check that the power cut covers my area, I phoned the power company and lit candles, and yet I was still trying to turn on the lights. There's worse to follow when, 2 hours later, the power still hasn't been restored. I went into the bathroom again, and my hand reached up and clicked the switch again. I stood there dumbstruck, wondering what could possibly have been going through my mind. The answer is absolutely nothing. This sort of behavior is the kind of thing the famous American behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner would have found comforting because it fit right in with his view of habits. The way I acted with my light switch looks similar to how his pigeons behaved in his most famous experiments. In one of these, Skinner got hungry pigeons in a box and fed them once every 15 seconds. So they began to exhibit unusual behaviors. One pigeon began stretching its neck just before the food was delivered. Another started walking in circles. Yet another stuck its head in the corner. Skinner's explanation was that the pigeons learned to associate moving their necks, or walking in circles, or sticking their heads in the corner with the reward of food. So they came to think that these movements somehow caused the food to arrive. The pigeons had become superstitious. The classic view of habits sees humans as much more complicated versions of Skinner's pecking pigeons. In this view, our habits are built up quite simply in response to rewards from the environment. For example, my job pays me money, which I want, and I learn from the environment that if I work harder, I can get promoted and get more money. So I develop a work ethic. Or I want to be liked more and I notice that smiling helps, so I start smiling more. And my habit of smiling at people is born, and so on. All the time I'm noticing, whether consciously or unconsciously, that a certain type of behavior is rewarded, and the more it is rewarded, the more I perform the behavior in the same situation. These are simplistic examples, but if you imagine them built up layer on layer, the idea is that you can get a view of how humans acquire their habits. To return to the pigeon for a moment. It wasn't really superstitious. It's too stupid for such a complicated idea. Whatever you say about me, I'm pretty sure I can outwit a pigeon, so how come I'm behaving just like it and trying to turn on a light switch during a power cut? It's because, to some extent, our responses to the world are quite pigeon-like. But clearly, to reduce all human behavior to that of pigeons is ridiculous. One of many ways in which humans differ from pigeons is that humans have dreams. We can't definitely say that a pigeon doesn't dream of one day owning its own statue to defecate on, setting up a colony on Mars, or being supreme leader, but it seems highly unlikely. In contrast, humans are chock full of dreams. To try and reach our dreams, we have all kinds of goals, many operating all at the same time, waiting for the right opportunity to be activated. We dream of a clean house, a well-educated son or daughter, and a promotion at work, so when the time is right, we get out the mop and bucket, or research the right schools, or practice our brown nosing. But when exactly is the right time? Certainly many of our habits are cued at exactly the right time. Like pigeons, we have learned when to execute particularly complex behaviors in response to the right situations and rewards. We spy on other diners in restaurants to gossip about them, browse Facebook at work for entertaining pictures, and phone a good friend when we need cheering up. All perfectly normal, everyday routines. What's more interesting, though, is when our habits go off the rails, when they don't line up with our goals, when the pigeon inside all of us goes haywire. We want to lose weight, but we keep eating mountains of cake. We dream of a promotion, but end up procrastinating at work. We want to reduce our drinking, but end up ordering another bottle of champagne. Here, our behavior seems to be in direct contravention of our goals. What we want isn't what we get. Part of the explanation is that habits can be performed unconsciously, and strong habits are difficult to change, so this takes us part of the way there. But in this chapter, we take it a step further to show why a pigeon theory of mind can't explain how we perform habits. For many of our everyday activities, our habits serve us very well, from getting dressed to looking both ways before crossing the street to asking after each other's health. The fact that we perform them unconsciously is more than just handy. In fact, ordinary life would be impossible if they weren't. But sometimes, habits can be cued up by the environment with little or no reference to our goals or intentions. Take some rather crafty research into habits of thought headed up by the social psychologist John Barge. Participants were split into two groups, and a little trick was played on them. They were asked to unscramble 5 words and make a 4-word sentence. For example, they were given things like, he, it, hides, finds instantly. It doesn't take too much imagination to discard the word hides and come up with he finds it instantly. For half the participants, the sentences were just to keep them busy, but for the other half, there was a secret message. The sentences had lots of words which stereotypically are associated with old people. Here are a few. Old, lonely, gray, selfish, careful, sentimental, wise, stubborn, courteous. Apologies to more mature listeners, but this test is designed to elicit stereotypes, so it has to be crude. After they had finished the test and thought the study was over, that's when it really got going. A confederate of the researchers sat on a nearby seat to see how long it would take each participant to cover the 9.75 meters to a strip of tape set up as a surreptitious finishing line. Without knowing it, the participants were involved in a race, and the results showed that the losers were those who'd been fed the old related words. On average, they took a full second longer to cover the distance, 8.3 seconds, than those who hadn't had the stereotype activated, 7.3 seconds. What had happened in people's minds was that they were reminded about the idea of being old. Because we have habitual ways of thinking about old people, what we usually call stereotypes, it's easy for these ideas to be activated unconsciously. Then, we act in line with these stereotypes without even realizing. Indeed, only one person in this study noticed that lots of the words were related to a stereotypical view of old age. What this study demonstrates is that a habit of thought activated outside conscious awareness can measurably change people's behavior. If that example strikes you as a little depressing, then you'll be happy to hear that you can improve people's performance, effectively have them perform good habits, by just the same method. In one piece of research, Asian American participants were invited to take a math test. Before they did it, though, some were primed with words that would activate stereotypes about Asian people, namely, a supposed superiority at math. This was done by flashing up words on a screen for less than 1/10 of a second. This is too quick to consciously perceive, but slow enough for the unconscious to register. It's the old subliminal advertising trick, which was actually a hoax originally, but does work. The words flashed up there were things like walk, Asia, Chinatown, and Hong Kong. The other half got words that had no relevance to ethnic stereotypes. Again, apologies to Asian people. The unconscious isn't as politically correct as it should be. What they found was that the priming had quite a marked effect on participants' performance. Asian Americans who had been primed with the stereotype got almost twice as many of the questions right as the other group. That is a serious performance gain for an unconscious cue. When the researchers looked closely at the data, they saw the reason for the performance boost. After being subliminally primed with an Asian stereotype, Asian Americans attempted more questions. So, it seemed that being reminded of the stereotype made them try harder. A habit of thought cued a habit of persistence. Now, on to an important question. Can all this unconscious priming of good habits of thought make you any money? For example, could it help you win Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Perhaps it could. In one study, participants were primed with either the idea of intelligence or that of stupidity. Then, they were asked a number of general knowledge questions like, who painted La Guernica? A. Dali, B. Miro, C. Picasso, or D. Velázquez? Just the same effect as before emerged. Subliminally priming people with the idea of intelligence meant they were better able to pluck the correct answer from memory. It was Picasso. These studies show that habits of thought and behavior can be activated automatically by people and things around us. We are continually being bombarded by subtle, and sometimes none too subtle, cues about how to behave. We process these automatically and unconsciously, and these impulses emerge as our habits, which we start performing without conscious thought. It's an extension of what we saw in the earlier studies by Wendy Wood. Students who moved from one university to another tended to change their habits because their environments changed. They weren't seeing the same people or being exposed to the same cues, so their TV watching habits, exercising habits, and so on changed. With fewer habits being activated, they became more responsive to their own intentions. What these examples demonstrate is direct cueing. That is, there's a direct link between some aspect of the environment, in this case, living somewhere different, and the particular behavior, watching less TV. But it's also possible for habits to be cued up in more roundabout ways. It's here that we enter the realm of motivated cueing. This is a weird effect where habits can become completely divorced from the goals they were originally designed to accomplish. This is a world where our ability to see why we're behaving in particular ways becomes even more blurred. Let's imagine for a moment you're a student at university. You're free of the constraints of home and family. You've escaped your parents, but you're not yet caught in the standard routines of adult life. You're not married, don't have kids, don't have house and car payments to make. You're as free as you'll ever be. You like to socialize, and like many students, you do so while drinking alcohol. With a cup of beer in hand, you can enjoy your newfound freedom, your new friends, and a future that seems endless. It's a heady concoction, and the feeling of being around your friends, of enjoying each other's company, is just as intoxicating as the alcohol. You're not drinking to escape, as adults sometimes do, from the boredom of their routines, nor are you trying to dull your senses to enable you to sleep. Quite the reverse. You are tasting freedom, the first freedom of adulthood and the promise of more to come. Psychologically, though, what's happening is that you are learning an association between the habit of drinking alcohol and the pleasure you get, not just from the feeling of intoxication, but also from the pleasures of socializing. In fact, for many drinking societies around the world, which includes the US, the UK, and other countries, this is a link that's ingrained by culture. In some ways, what we really want is just to socialize with other people, but because of established rituals, we end up drinking alcohol at the same time. When you think about it, this is an odd claim because it is saying that drinking alcohol serves almost no purpose. You might as well perform any kind of ritual, like weaving a basket, dancing, or intermittently breaking into song. Your real aim is to get pleasure from socializing, and the drinking is merely a byproduct. Many drinkers, occasional or otherwise, would argue that the alcohol enhances the experience or even enables it, rather than being a byproduct of it. There is certainly some truth to these points, but there is still a significant element of habit in there. Just this disconnect between goal and habit in drinking behavior has been shown in the laboratory. Psychologists have used jumbled sentence priming techniques similar to the slow-walking research described previously. Again, the idea is to prime the unconscious with ideas that the conscious mind is not aware of, and then see how people's behavior changes. In one experiment, instead of focusing on stereotypes or intelligence, though, they wanted to manipulate the desire to socialize. They did this by asking half their participants to think about cities which are good for socializing, and half to think about cities that are good for historical sites. The idea was to have half of them unconsciously thinking about the goal of socializing, with the other half acting as the control group. Then, as a thank you for taking part in the study, participants chose a discount voucher for either tea, coffee, or beer, wine. What the researchers found was that for those who were habitual drinkers, unconsciously thinking about socializing made them more likely to choose the alcoholic drink. For those who weren't habitual drinkers, though, it didn't make any difference. So, just the mere idea of socializing was activating the idea of drinking alcohol. What this is showing is a disconnect between the goal, feeling good from socializing, and the method being used to reach that goal, drinking alcohol. One of the ironies of the effect of alcohol is that it reduces our ability to reason effectively. This means we have to rely on our habits more. So, once you've had a drink, it's even easier for the goal of feeling good about socializing automatically to activate the habit of more drinking. And we all know where that leads. What's going on in this study is similar to what happened to me when I tried to turn on the bathroom light during a power cut. My goal was to illuminate the room, which was cued up by my entering the bathroom and finding myself standing in darkness. And so it cued up an habitual behavior, turning on the light switch. Unfortunately, the habit was useless under these circumstances, but because the association was so strong, I perform the behavior anyway, despite the fact that it doesn't achieve my goal. In this case, the error of my ways is soon obvious as I'm still standing in darkness. In contrast, dangerous habits like drinking too much alcohol creep up on people in a much more insidious fashion. Although we don't realize it, these disconnects between our everyday goals and the habits we perform are going on all the time. Because we've built up such strong associations between habits and goals, we don't notice when our habits stop achieving our goals because real life is more complicated than an on-off switch. Let's say you want to change your travel habits. You decide that every now and then, instead of taking the car for short journeys, you'll walk. The store is only a 15-minute walk away, so why not get a little exercise? One day you run out of milk, and before you know it, you're sitting in the car with the keys in your hand. Why is that? And what happened to the goal of habit change? Dutch psychologists Henk Arts and Aap Dijksterhuis have looked at a very similar situation in research on travel habits in the Netherlands. They found that those people in their studies who were habitual bicycle riders automatically thought about their bikes when primed with the idea of traveling. This didn't happen to people who weren't habitual bike riders. This is precisely the link that we are fighting against when trying to change habits. Because of the automatic unconscious association between a goal, like going to the local store, and habit, like taking the car, we're already in the car and halfway to the store before we think anything of it. What's emerging is a more subtle view of habits than pigeon theory can support. There isn't just a simple connection in our minds between something we want, like sex, money, or chocolate, and some behavior we perform to get it, like internet dating, robbery, or using a vending machine. Unlike pigeons, we have plans, goals, and dreams, as well as desires and drives. It's why human life is so complicated. The catch is that our goals and desires can be activated unconsciously at the wrong time by the people or things around us. Sometimes we're like the students walking slowly down the corridor because someone had unconsciously reminded them of old age. Or we're like the students drinking too much beer because they want to socialize rather than because they really want more beer. It can all mean we end up performing behaviors that don't line up with our long-term goals. The problem for making and breaking habits is that so much is happening in the unconscious mind. Since the unconscious is generally like the Earth's core, impenetrable and unknowable, we can't access it directly. This means that deeply held goals and desires can come into play without our realizing. Not only this, but our conscious intentions to change can prove too weak in the face of the behaviors we perform efficiently and automatically, with only minimal awareness. What does all this mean for our attempts to control ourselves and our chances of making changes? It's this question that dominates the rest of the book. In the third and final section, we look at how we can use our conscious minds in concert with the environment to make the lasting changes that we so desire. Before that, we look at how habits play out in everyday contexts. Here, discovered over decades of research on how we work, socialize, use the internet, and more, we find further clues to molding the unconscious to our will and making lasting changes to habits. Part 2. Everyday Habits. Chapter 5. The Daily Grind. Luke Reinhardt is bored. Really, unbelievably bored. He's a psychiatrist with a wife and 2 children, a moderately successful career, and a nice home. But he's fed up with it. He has become bored with all the repetition in life, the endless sameness of the days, and the activities in those days. He feels like he's explored all the regular avenues of interest that life has to offer, and all he sees is mundanity and tedium. He has tried to find solace in therapy, existentialism, and Zen, but nothing works. Instead, he feels mired in routine, locked into the numbing repetition of everyday life. One night, he stumbles upon what seems like a solution to the boredom of existence: dice. Instead of following his normal everyday routines, he will periodically write down a list of 6 options, including actions he wouldn't normally choose. Then he will roll the dice and obey it, whatever the result. The force of habit is subverted both by consciously making a list of options and by allowing the dice to choose randomly between them. Soon, life for Reinhardt has become anything but boring. In everyday situations, at home, at work, and while traveling, he experiences the force of habit pulling him towards his normal routines, and the dice pulling him towards randomness, chaos, and new experience. What he calls dice therapy helps him fight the patterns ingrained into his personality to such an extent that he becomes liberated from his own self, and indeed the idea of selfhood. The character of Luke Reinhardt is the fictional protagonist of cult classic The Dice Man, a novel by George Cockcroft, himself a psychologist, published in 1971. In the novel, Reinhardt starts off by urinating into plant pots, walking backwards, and instigating habit-breaking week, then goes completely off the rails, leaving his wife and family, committing sexual assaults, murder, and founding a cult. While we might not agree with the choices Reinhardt gives himself in the novel, and the path he ends up on, the idea that the randomness of the dice provides an escape from everyday routine is certainly appealing. The question is, if new experiences are so exciting, then why aren't we all dice men and women? Why don't we give ourselves up to randomness to escape the confines of habit? One answer lies in Cockcroft's novel. Reinhardt finds that once his experiment is underway in earnest, many of those around him are appalled by his new, seemingly random behavior. That's because not only do we take comfort in our own daily routines, we take comfort in the routines of others. This is the other side of habits. The more we are exposed to experiences in life, the more comfortable we become with them, and the associated positive feelings can increase. That's why research shows that students sitting in lecture theaters tend to sit in the same seats, or as near as they can. Even across different rooms, they sit with their friends in similar configurations. It's also why air travelers feel more comfortable about flying the more they fly. Routine boosts feelings of safety. It's not just behavioral routines that we feel more comfortable with, it's also intellectual routines. Routines reduce the stress associated with much practiced mental processes because they can be performed easily and unconsciously. Think of experienced emergency room doctors who are able to stay calm when confronted by a dying patient by using habits drummed into them over the years. Routines can also provide a safety net when we're under extreme emotional stress, such as after the death of a loved one or some other major upheaval. We can find solace in the reassuring routines of everyday life, the regular tick-tock of getting up, going about our business, and heading off to bed at the same time, just as if nothing happened. Despite the comfort and security that habits can provide, they generally don't get a lot of good press. The expression, "the daily grind," doesn't exactly summon up visions of skipping through sunlit meadows on a hazy midsummer afternoon. Rather, it makes us feel like robots. Robots who get up in the morning, go to work, come back, eat, turn on the TV, spend 30 minutes worrying about tomorrow before falling asleep, only to get up the next day, often without enough sleep, and repeat the whole routine again. Where's the fun in that? People do experience emotions while performing habits, but usually not ones that are related to the habit itself. Our minds are off somewhere else, and the emotions we experience are related to wherever our minds have gone. Perhaps this helps explain why one study has found that people are only half as likely to feel pride about a habit compared with a non-habit. This suggests we don't associate our habitual behaviors with our ideal selves. This is odd because so many habits are good ones, like being punctual, washing our clothes, or remembering the good times. In the same study, the researchers found that participants thought habits weren't as important as non-habits in reaching goals and were relatively uninformative about themselves and others. How come we think that almost half our daily behaviors, or maybe more, say little or nothing about us as people? Actually, these are just the sort of results we'd expect given what we already know about habits. It's a result of their basic elements, that they are unconsciously cued by situations, that we sometimes have little control over them, and they are performed with little emotion related to the habit itself. The effect of these factors is to give us a reduced sense of control over our actions. To us, from the inside, we can become detached from our habits, as though we are being externally controlled. In the same study, which asked about habits and pride, participants were also asked how much ownership they felt towards their habits. The responses were once again underwhelming. People were less sure of why they performed habits than non-habits. Also, they thought they were less likely than non-habits to be caused by either the situation they were in or the other people around them. So overall, people didn't feel that much of a causal connection between themselves and their routine behaviors, which accounts for the lack of pride and negative emotions. All of this routine can make us feel like rats stuck in a maze. And it's no coincidence that that's how we know the basics of habit formation. Researchers such as the American psychologist Clark Hull had rats running around mazes trying to find pieces of cheese, and from this he saw how habits were formed at the most basic level. As the mice repeated the same behaviors in the same circumstances, they became quicker to the cheese, much like people wandering around underground rail systems looking for their destinations. It's all about stimulus and response. The stimulus is the way out, and the response is to explore the tunnels and escalators looking for that magic exit sign. Of course, there isn't just an association being built up between stimulus and response. It's more conscious and goal-driven than that. It's about an outcome, or in this case, a way out. What we're learning is an association between an action and an outcome. For instance, if I take the North Line from Waterloo and get off at Goodge Street, I'll get to University College London. In animal learning terms, a habit is formed when we move from action-outcome links to stimulus-response links. In other words, we start paying less attention to the outcome than we do to simply responding to the environment, usually in the same way we have before. The reason daily habits can make us feel like a rat stuck in a maze is because that's a very similar model to the way we're behaving. This might sound a bit demeaning to humanity, but remember, we're talking about the automatic, unconscious aspects of our behavior. After all, the everyday habits we learn do some great things for us. Without the parts of our brain that help make habits, our lives would be that much more difficult. People with Parkinson's, a degenerative brain disease, have exactly this problem. The disease causes a decrease in the neurotransmitter dopamine in a part of the brain called the basal ganglia. This structure is important in controlling our movement, hence the characteristic shakiness of people with Parkinson's. But the basal ganglia is also thought to be vital to how we form new habits. With impaired neurotransmitter function in this part of the brain, Parkinson's patients have difficulty learning new habits and can even forget old habits. This deficit has been demonstrated in an experiment by Barbara Knowlton at the University of California, Los Angeles, and fellow researchers. They recruited some normal control participants, some participants with Parkinson's, and some who had memory problems. They all carried out a task in which they had to try and predict the weather, rain or shine, from 4 mysterious cards with various geometric shapes on them. Participants are presented with the 4 cards in different orders, over and over again, then told the weather that's associated with them. The task is set up to make it very difficult to consciously work out the association between which cards show up and the outcome. But there is a pattern which the normal controls pick up unconsciously. After a while, they improve from 50% accuracy, pure chance, up to 70%. People with Parkinson's, though, don't improve because they can't learn the unconscious association. They can't learn the habit. The amnesiac patients, on the other hand, do just fine. The test doesn't rely on being able to consciously remember things, only that your unconscious is in good working order, which for Parkinson's patients, unfortunately, it isn't. This is the kind of unconscious habit learning that most of us rely on every day of our lives to help get us through the most mundane situations, like using a parking meter, operating our mobile phones, or making small talk. Social habits. Let's do a little childhood reminiscing. Think back to the meals you had in a specific house, at a specific table with your family. Can you remember where you sat? Can you remember where your mother and father and siblings sat? Many listeners like me will see themselves sitting in a particular spot with other members of their family always sitting in the same positions. I remember in one house my dad always sat to my left, my mom to the right, and my sisters opposite. The routine was different when we moved to another house. There, my mom still sat at one end of the table, but my dad sat opposite me because the head of the table was flush against the wall. If I think back to either of these houses and try to imagine myself sitting on the other side of the table, it feels wrong, even now. Perhaps you can remember some other aspects of family meals. Was there generally talking while you ate, or was that reserved for afterwards? Did you eat certain foods on certain days? Was Sunday lunch special? What happened when guests were there? Psychologists have studied these sorts of family routines like bedtimes, chores, watching television, Christmas time, and family reunions. But it's the importance of meal times that comes up again and again. Despite increasingly fractured lifestyles, many families still believe strongly that they should eat together. This appears to be no bad thing, as evidence suggests these kinds of family rituals are healthy. Families that have established good, predictable routines tend to be happier, with both parents and children being better adjusted. Family rituals provide a kind of safety blanket. They increase the family's sense of togetherness and help build its identity. As a child, this sense of differing routines and identities was never more obvious to me than when I visited a friend's house where they frequently did things so differently I might as well have been on the moon. The habits of both behavior and thought we develop as children can live on long after we've flown the nest. Early social habits in particular can have striking effects on the rest of our lives. For example, take one of the most natural social habits most of us develop at a young age: being polite to strangers. We may occasionally be rude to people we know well, like our partners, our friends, and our families. But when it comes to strangers, usually, we are quite polite. Those of us who have the habit were socialized into it at a very young age. Our parents encouraged us to say please and thank you to strangers. And over the years, we began to notice that when we projected warmth at other people, they treated us better. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy because our habit of expecting acceptance leads to warmer behavior, which leads to greater acceptance by others. Not everyone learns this habit, though. For whatever reason, but probably a mixture of genetics and circumstances, some learn at an early age to be very pessimistic about other people. So pessimistic that it doesn't seem worthwhile to think positively about strangers. Some people learn to expect rejection from others, and so, ironically, that's exactly what they get. Whether we're socially pessimistic or optimistic is a habit of social thinking that has huge implications for our social lives. Just this one good or bad habit can help lead us towards either a lonely life or one filled with friends. In the normal course of things, though, even those who are socially pessimistic will have picked up friends through school, work, and other interests. But how do we choose who we're friends with? The standard psychological account is that much of it is down to similarity. Consciously or otherwise, we choose people who have similar backgrounds, tastes, attitudes, and preferences. Certainly, many studies conducted in psychological laboratories around the world back this up. If you sit two random people down together, they are more likely to express liking for each other when there is also similarity between their personalities, cultural background, attitudes, and even their physical appearance. This has long been the orthodox view amongst social psychologists, but it obscures something vital about the importance of our behavioral habits. Think about a friend of yours, along with the context in which you first met, and where you meet to socialize now. For many people, both will be stable situations. For example, the friend you met at school, you now meet up with once a month for a meal or in a bar. Or the friend you met at work, you now socialize with at home. Still, intuitively, we tend to think that where friends meet and what they do together isn't as important as what they say and how they connect psychologically. But is the place and the activity as incidental to friendship as we tend to think? Evidence that points more in the direction of habits comes from a study of friendship which measured the attitudes of participants, along with what activities they took part in. People were asked whether they liked things like hang gliding, chess, football, or reading, as well as what attitudes they had towards things like religion, politics, and economics. Then the researchers used statistical methods to look at the connections between friendship and both activities and attitudes. They wanted to see where friendship was forged. Was it more what they did together, or was it more how much they shared similar attitudes? The researchers found that friends tended to share the same preferred activities much more than the same attitudes. In fact, the attitudes of friends had no more in common than those of strangers. This was the exact reverse of what people expected, which was that their attitudes would be more similar than their activities. As the subtitle of the study memorably encapsulated it, "Those who play together stay together." It becomes clear that what we do in similar circumstances is tightly bound up with our social ties. It's hard to tease apart whether mutual liking or mutually enjoyable activities come first, but we probably tend to underestimate just how important our shared habits are in forming and maintaining our friendships. No doubt our inability to notice just how important our habits are in our friendship ties is down to their unconscious nature. We frequently find ourselves in the same contexts, with the same people, talking out the same things, without specifically willing it and often without noticing. And that's not a bad thing. Without the tendency to associate with others in regular contexts, we'd miss out on one of life's great pleasures. In some ways, love itself is a binding together of habits. Two people's habits become intertwined so that, as interdependence increases, both people benefit from the routine activities within the relationship. What could be a more admirable habit than love? Work habits. Like almost every other area of human existence, workplaces are also hotbeds of habits. At work, habits do a lot more for us than we might imagine. It's not just about getting through the mundane parts of our working lives successfully, like commuting, making routine phone calls, writing routine emails, or making the right noises in meetings. According to one influential academic account, routines are at the heart of how the economy works, because they store knowledge, provide stability, reduce uncertainty, and help people work together. Perhaps more importantly, routines allow people to coordinate with one another. When people work together towards a common goal, they need to have a rough idea what other people are doing, how long it will take, and what they will produce. Without these kinds of routines, goods will arrive at warehouses with no one to unload them. Company reports would have missing chapters, and both children and teachers would keep missing their classes. The fact that we, mostly, turn up on time, and the work we've done ourselves, mostly, meshes with others, means that all manner of social institutions can begin to function. Without routines, work would be a comedy of errors. But working together isn't just about turning up on time. It's also about learning how we do things around here. When you start at a new job, you can read all the manuals and know theoretically how things are supposed to work, yet nothing beats experience. The simple reason is that many of the rules we work by are unwritten. That's why many employees say their managers don't know the half of what goes on in their organization. Sometimes this is called organizational culture, but it's really about learning small routines that make the organization work. One fascinating example of how important habits are at work is in bicycle manufacture. Although we now think of bicycles as rather ancient and well-established technology, around the turn of the 20th century they weren't. Bicycles came in all sorts of designs. Originally they had no chains, tires, or gears, and the wheels were different sizes. This made them difficult to ride and quite dangerous as they tended to throw you over the handlebars. This was quaintly called a header. As companies worked towards what became known as the safety bicycle, the industry went through all sorts of foments. With the prospect of big profits, the number of manufacturers exploded, as did the rate of innovation. In their analysis of the bicycle industry between 1880 and 1918, Glenn Dowell and Anand Swaminathan wanted to see which types of innovation worked best. Was a manufacturer that completely reinvented the bicycle with huge leaps more likely to survive? Or was it a better strategy to go slow and get it right? What they found was that manufacturers who tried to change too quickly were most likely to go out of business. The same was true of the manufacturers who were too slow to change. The sweet spot was in the middle. The bicycle manufacturers who were most likely to survive were those that kept hold of their old good routines as well as trying to establish new ones. These companies continued to produce their old product lines at the same time as their new ones. In this case, the cutoff was at about 4 years. After that, companies began to stagnate. Workers could then move smoothly and, over time, to the new product line, but they brought their old habits with them. Companies who overlapped their production could also keep their routine relationships with suppliers, distributors, and customers, which further helped them prosper. So, in effect, companies' routines and habits can and do evolve. Rather than being stuck in their ruts, workers adapt to the new circumstances, slowly but surely, while bringing along the vestiges of their old habits. Research in a variety of industries, such as medicine, technology, and car manufacturing, bears this out. Routine behaviors don't hold completely still in institutions and organizations. As with all habits, organizational or personal, it all depends on how we deal with the feedback from the environment and whether we are ready and able to make changes. Travel habits. The number of habits involved in the simple act of traveling is huge. Take driving. Habits mean we automatically operate the indicators, turn on the radio, respond to the car in front braking, and anticipate the actions of other drivers, all on top of navigating to the supermarket. Without habits, the drain on our memory and our decision-making powers would be too great. Consciously having to recall how to brake and which road to take would take an enormous toll. We'd have a stroke before pulling out of the drive. At the societal level, our driving habits create all sorts of environmental problems. In the United Kingdom, the cost of petrol is astronomical. Cars are expensive, and in London especially, the roads are crammed with cars. Famously, the average speed in London is somewhere around 10 miles per hour, perhaps slower, which led to the marvelous headline, "London cars move no faster than chickens." Although, that is chickens running at top speed. Of course, many journeys are necessary, but especially in cities, there are all sorts of cheaper and more efficient alternatives to cars. Given the gridlock, why do people continue to drive? Whatever the political or environmental arguments, from a psychological perspective, people's behavior needs explaining. Travel choices are powerfully shaped by habits because they can override our intentions to change. But where do these habits come from in the first place? A clue comes from a German study which looked at what influence socialization had on whether people chose to use their cars for transport. Almost 4,000 students at a German university were asked questions about how they traveled. Across 2 studies, the researchers looked at a variety of factors that might influence what method students took to travel to university. Amongst other things, they were asked about how much their parents used public transport, how much they thought a driving license was an initiation into adulthood, and how open-minded their peers were about different forms of transport. The results showed that each of these factors was only important in travel choices insofar as it tended to create traveling habits. In other words, students were socialized into, say, car use by their parents, and this early buildup of habitual behavior then took over. This shows how quickly it's possible to inherit travel habits and how immune they soon become to things we think might influence them, like peer pressure and feeling in control of choices. This isn't to say that all our travel choices are habitual. Many are not. The problem with habitual travel choices, though, is that the more ingrained they become, the less likely they are to be consciously reevaluated. For example, we might continue to drive to work in the summer, despite the fact that cycling is much cheaper and healthier because of the habit built up during the winter. Or we might automatically plan a new trip by car because we always use the car, without even considering the available alternatives like trains or coaches. Lab research finds that if people habitually drive to stores that aren't within walking distance, they don't usually consider going by foot, even when it's a store that is within walking distance. Encouraging people to change their travel choices is very hard. Research suggests that the key is getting people to consciously reconsider their options before they automatically get into the car. Clearly, this is much easier said than done. One method that's been tested is handing out free bus passes, which can work to weaken driving habits. Still, any method that's used needs to take into account the fact that while travel choices may originally have been made for rational reasons, once they become automatic and so unconscious, rationality goes out the window. To break a habit like travel choice, we need more than just the desire. We need a specific type of plan, which we'll come onto in the third section of this book. Eating habits. What could be more routine than eating? And as everyone who is on a diet knows, all that eating adds up. If a man consumes 3,000 calories per day, then that's more than 1 million each year, and getting on for 100 million in a lifetime. Every day we make all sorts of decisions about eating, like where, when, what, and how much. At work, we might decide to go to a salad bar rather than a fast food restaurant, or we might decide to skip lunch altogether. At home in the evening, we choose between doing some cooking or putting a ready meal in the oven. However, because many of our habits are unconscious, we often don't notice the decisions we're making. Like our other daily routines, the effects of all these decisions accumulate over time and are there for all to see around the waist. So, how many decisions about food do we make each day, and how many are we aware of? Brian Wansink and Jeffrey Sobel asked 154 college students to estimate how many food decisions they made every day. The average turned out to be 14.4, which sounds like a reasonable number. But then the participants were pushed to really think about it. They broke down their eating into 5 different aspects that any journalist will recognize: the who, what, when, where, and how, as in how much. For example, when do you start and stop eating? Who's with you? Where do you eat? And so on. From this, they were able to make a much better estimate of the total number of decisions about food that people make each day. The average was a mind-boggling 226.7, which is frighteningly high in comparison to their initial estimate. To check this, 3 participants were given a clicker which they clicked every time they made a food-based decision over a 24-hour period. This also suggested that the number of daily decisions about food was over 200. This study is a good demonstration of how our eating habits, like our work, socializing, and driving habits, fly under the conscious radar. Now, a critic might say that there's a bit of cheating going on here to inflate the difference between our estimated and actual number of food-related decisions each day. For example, people don't tend to think of deciding not to eat as a food-related decision, although of course it is. But even when only decisions to positively eat food were counted, the average was still 59 per day. And as you'd expect, obese people made more food-related decisions, presumably because they were eating more food. Wansink and Sobel call this mindless eating, and Brian Wansink has written a fascinating book with that title. What this means is that many of our eating habits take their cue from quite simple habitual decisions we make, often without our realizing. You can see how little we know about what we eat in some circumstances from a study of popcorn eating in a movie theater. This found that people given a 240-gram box of popcorn ate 53% more popcorn than those given a 120-gram box. It isn't that surprising that when given more food, people ate more. What is surprising is that when asked afterwards to estimate how much they had eaten, only 6% thought they'd eaten more than the usual. Then, when told about the larger container, only 5% of people thought that it had influenced their eating, while 77% said they were hungry, and 15% flatly denied they ate more. In another study, the researchers found that even when they made the popcorn less palatable, it had less influence on consumers than the size of the container they were eating from. We tend to think that how much we eat is mostly affected by the food's quality and our appetite. These studies suggest otherwise. In fact, we are taking relatively trivial cues from the environment, and along with our habits, these are having a large impact on our intake. The examples go on and on. The size of plates, the people we are with, whether we're watching television, and so on. But the general point is the same. The situation we are in cues our eating habits, and we don't notice the choices we're making because they are unconscious. Shopping habits. In the past few decades, a revolution has happened in how companies market their products to us. This revolution is partly a result of advances in computing and the ability to capture and process data, and partly of a key psychological insight. By now, this revolution is far from a secret, as most of us carry around the evidence right there in our pockets. Loyalty cards. Before the advent of loyalty cards, companies marketed their products to us on the back of some limited research based on putting us into one of a number of broad categories. For example, one marketing segmentation system called VALS, which stands for Values, Attitudes, and Lifestyles, splits consumers into groups like innovators, thinkers, believers, achievers, and survivors, amongst others. In theory, each group is thought to have a different mix of motivation and resources. In reality, of course, the categories are crude and can't hope to represent everyone in all of their diversity. Then, along came store loyalty cards and the ability to collect and process huge amounts of data about people's shopping habits. Soon enough, some retailers, like the supermarket Tesco, were discovering that this data was a mine of useful information. They could work out in which stores to launch new, expensive ranges of foods, and which areas of the store particular customers didn't habitually use. For large companies, the identification and leveraging of quite subtle habits and patterns in the data could make them billions of dollars. Where we were once in vague and often illusory marketing categories, as consumers we can now be brought into sharp focus with a glance at our purchase history. With the data that online retailers are now collecting on us, this is only the beginning. Part of the reason loyalty cards can be so useful for marketers is that they capture people's shopping habits, and our habits are surprisingly predictive of our future purchasing, sometimes more so than our intentions. In one study that tested how shopping habits stack up against intentions, participants were asked how often they bought food from a fast food restaurant. They were then asked about their intentions over the next week. How often did they intend to buy fast food? What they found was that when people's habits were weak, their intentions strongly predicted their behavior. In other words, without an established habit, people bought what they intended to. However, when the habit was strong, intentions were only a weak predictor of behavior. So, in the face of a strong habit, we sometimes don't buy the things we intend to. Instead, we just do what we did before. The idea that strong habits rule our intentions goes against our intuitive sense of how shopping works. It feels to us like we choose a product because it provides the best trade-off between what we're prepared to pay and what it offers. Since we're satisfied with our initial purchase, we go and buy the same thing until we're no longer satisfied. Then, perhaps the quality drops, or there's another cheaper product, and so we change our choice. This story we tell ourselves is the exact same story marketing people tell each other. If you read a marketing textbook, they are filled with page after page on consumer loyalty and satisfaction. Satisfied customers are loyal customers, and loyal customers are profitable customers. People are assumed to learn from their experiences. Poor evaluations are thought to lead to lower satisfaction. That leads to switching products. Although this is such a familiar story for marketers and consumers alike, there are all kinds of hints that this isn't the way our minds really work. If satisfaction was the key to keeping customers loyal, then why are between 65 and 85% of people who switch brands either satisfied or very satisfied? The fact is that marketing professionals have very little idea what makes people switch from one brand to another. On its own, satisfaction predicts very little of people's behavior, perhaps as little as 1/4. For the student of habits, this makes sense, since it's easy for habits to become divorced from intentions. When the initial choice is made to buy a product and subsequently made again and again in the same context, then it's likely to become a habit, meaning we make the same choice without considering the options. For many purchases, this isn't a problem, of course, and saves us time. Where brand loyalty does become important is when purchases are made in new and different situations. For example, choosing a new car is unlikely to be an habitual purchase. This all leaves us with a rather disturbing answer to the seemingly simple question of why we buy what we buy. It's this: much of what we buy regularly, we buy because we bought it before. While these products might once have met our requirements, and we might once have thought carefully about them, there's no reason they still do. Our needs and what's on offer may well have changed without our noticing. Worse, we are likely to cover up this fact by automatically justifying our own decisions to ourselves, and because we often have little access to our own unconscious, it's easy to become largely unconscious consumers. The very fact that habits are so easy to perform makes them attractive. People are what psychologists call cognitive misers. For the most part, we prefer to avoid difficult decisions. So it's partly the mental costs of switching that puts us off. Habits, on the other hand, can literally feel good. When we can quickly choose a product with minimal thought, we feel more successful. Each time we buy it and use it, we become more comfortable with it, and the other options fall further and further behind, unless the product or service is truly awful. Set against this, we avoid casting the net wide for other options, and deliberation hurts the brain. Not much, but just enough to make us wonder whether a slightly better tasting peanut butter is really worth the effort. Habits can be so strong that they don't respond to the rewards which marketers throw at us to encourage switching. Even the standard economic idea that consumers are rational and will respond to rewards is suspect. That's why research finds that habitual shoppers often don't respond very strongly to incentives like special offers. Habitual consumers are so locked into their habits that they don't have much effect. Of course, not all of our shopping is habitual. Some people are happy to switch their patronage to wherever the deal is best after putting in the necessary effort. Most of us, though, probably have a sliding scale, with some of our shopping being habitual and other parts not. While we're likely habitually to buy the same brand of milk from the same store each week, buying a new phone is unlikely to be an habitual purchase. What if you're staring into the kitchen cupboards and wondering why it's the same old product staring back at you? Or what if the monthly grocery bill has one too many zeros on the end? There are 3 factors which are most likely to make us robotic, habitual consumers: being short of time, being distracted, and having limited self-control. It's a double-edged sword. Relying on shopping habits saves us time and effort and lets us think about something else, but we also get the same things we always get. Ordinarily, this may not be a bad thing, eating the same things all the time, because you're tired and distracted, while shopping is, well, a recipe for boredom. The trouble is that old habits are hard to unlearn. Sometimes, though, we do get shaken out of our old habits by changes in our lives. This was first demonstrated by the consumer behavior specialist Alan Andreessen, who suggested that there are particular moments in people's lives when their consumer habits are most ready to change. He interviewed hundreds of people and asked them whether they had changed their usual brands in the last 6 months. He also asked people whether they had experienced any major life events in the last 6 months, whether positive or negative. When he looked at the data, what he found was that the more major life events they'd experienced, like changing employer, getting married, moving house or school, the more they had changed brands. Not only that, but people who had changed were also more likely to be satisfied with the switch they'd made. Subsequent research has also found that major life changes are likely to lead to increased variation in consumer habits. The academic explanations for these changes are like the stories we tell ourselves, often quite complicated and sometimes misguided. The truth is probably simpler. Major life changes mean changes in situations, which means old habits are disrupted. After moving house, you visit a different store, which has a different layout, and suddenly, choices that have been largely unconscious, cued by the situation, are offered up for deliberation to the conscious mind once more. Or, after switching employers, you earn more money and decide to move up to a more expensive brand. In either case, willingly or otherwise, your conscious mind is back in the hot seat making all those crucial decisions about which brand of coffee to buy or where to take your dry cleaning. Most of us at some point find the daily grind is getting us down. It's not just work, but our routine feels old. Sometimes we want to break out and do something different. We feel like seeing some new sights, meeting some new friends, somehow changing up the old routines. But anyone who has tried this knows that ingrained habits are hard to budge, and they get harder as we age. Habit provides a safety zone, but it's also a kind of cage from which escape is hard. One reason habits are so hard to change is that we start performing them without conscious deliberation. When we shop, socialize, eat, work, and travel, it's often difficult to spot that we're responding in the same way to the same situation, and sometimes that response could be improved. The thread running through all of these everyday activities is that the first step is simply to notice our own habitual behavior. For organizations to change and improve their habits, they have to notice and respond to what they are doing. For people who want to change their eating, the first step is to notice what they are already eating. For those who want to change how they travel, the first step is to stop and think about the choices rather than following the same old routine. Everyday life doesn't have to be such a grind, if only we could notice our own behavior. Perhaps surrendering ourselves to the randomness of dice is too extreme a solution, but certainly there are ways of mixing things up that would improve our everyday existence. Like the bicycle manufacturers who successfully survived the industry cull, we need to try and spot which routines are helping us and which routines are killing us, and then try to work out how to replace them. But slowly. Chapter 6. Stuck in a depressing loop. Around the age of 11, Stanley became obsessed with symmetry. Suddenly, everything he did had to be symmetrical. His writing had to be perfect, with all the lines, loops, and dots just so. When he walked down the street, his arms had to swing exactly in time with the stride of his legs so that he seemed to walk like a robot. When he took tests in school, he became more obsessed with shading the answer boxes precisely within the lines than with getting to the end of the test. Later, certain numbers started to go around and around in his head, particularly the number 6. He began to repeat everything he did at least twice. He went around his paper route again and again to check he hadn't missed a delivery, and soon these habits were taking over his life. Stanley called these obsessions mosquitoes of the mind. Stanley is one of the sufferers of obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD, documented by Dr. Judith L. Rappaport's book, The Boy Who Couldn't Stop Washing, and he is far from alone. The number of people who have it at any one time may be as high as 2%. This means there could be about 6 million people with OCD in the US and over 1 million people with it in the UK. OCD is classified as a kind of anxiety disorder. People who suffer from OCD have obsessive or habitual thoughts about, say, being clean, which drive their repetitive behaviors like hand washing. People with OCD are almost always aware that they are obsessive and that they are repeating the same behaviors over and over again, yet they find it difficult to stop. OCD is a disorder of intrusive, repetitive, anxiety-provoking thoughts. The compulsive behavior is carried out because it helps to relieve the anxiety associated with the thoughts. People with OCD have all sorts of obsessions and compulsions, but across cultures and countries, 3 are practically universal: cleanliness, checking things are done, and imposing order. These are not exactly wild and wacky obsessions that are difficult to empathize with. Who hasn't wanted to tidy up the house, wash their hands, and check that they've turned off the oven? Perhaps you've even cleaned, checked, or washed a little more assiduously than might have been called for. Research tells us that most people experience unwanted thoughts, images, or ideas flashing through their heads from time to time, and some more than others. This makes sense, since there are all sorts of excellent reasons why it's handy to be clean, well-organized, and on time. Even people who are always late, untidy, and disorganized know it's not ideal. What is it that makes regular, everyday worries go over the line and become a disorder? We don't know exactly, but there are convincing theories. The problem for people with OCD is that relatively normal fears, ideas, or images aren't ignored or discarded as random thoughts that the mind often creates. Instead, a worrying image like stabbing someone with a knife, which may start only as a brief flash of an idea crossing the mind, takes on much more importance than it should. A person with OCD can become fixated on this type of image. They can come to believe that they might act on it. To try and counteract this perceived danger, the person might compulsively avoid knives and continually check on the safety of their child. This is a perfectly rational response to an irrational thought, and the response also works after a fashion. The worrying thought is dispelled, although only for a time. The obsessive habitual behavior works like a safety blanket, comforting the sufferer. But the very fact that the compulsion relieves the anxiety about the obsession sets up a reinforcing loop. As the habit grows in strength, the mental state of the sufferer spirals downward. Not only do OCD sufferers have to cope with their habitual obsessions and compulsions, they also frequently suffer other mental health problems. 2/3 will also experience depression at some point in their lives, and up to 90% will suffer from one other major disorder. This underlies a really important point about mental health problems. They often don't fit neatly into diagnostic boxes. People who are depressed are also frequently anxious. People with obsessive-compulsive disorder are also often depressed, and so on. As a result, the modern view is that these disorders exist on a continuum. But the overlaps don't just occur between different types of mental health problems. They also overlap with so-called normal people. It's not just people with full-blown OCD who can get thoughts stuck in their heads. Quite naturally, therefore, the language of psychology, psychiatry, and especially psychoanalysis has permeated everyday life to a huge extent. Many of us are now familiar with phrases like acting out, venting, bipolar, and borderline. While perhaps not everyday language, they've gained much more recognition in recent years. So much so that the terms are now used in technically inaccurate senses. People may say things like, "I get totally OCD about cleaning my kitchen." When I conducted a poll on my website, this phrase was voted the most irritating example of psychobabble. I have some sympathy with those who say that this sort of usage is offensive to people who are really suffering. But in another way, this type of linguistic slippage between how we talk about normal and abnormal mental functioning is telling. It hints at how narrow the gap is between one and the other, and it indicates something about all of our own everyday experience. The obsessions of people with OCD may seem weird and extreme, especially to those who experience them, but they are rooted in something fundamental about what it means to be human. We, all of us, worry, and we all want to feel safe. Because habits can provide this reassurance, but they can also get out of control. They are both savior and curse. People with Tourette's syndrome experience compulsions that are somewhat similar to those in OCD. Tourette's, which is most common in childhood, is often associated with involuntary swearing, but only about 10% of sufferers actually exhibit this. The similarities between OCD and Tourette's aren't surprising, since the two disorders have genetic similarities and are often comorbid. People who have Tourette's also often have OCD. Sufferers report feeling an urge building up inside them which has to be dissipated by a behavior, like an outward stabbing of the elbow or some other movement of the body. The tics can be set off both by internal processes and by aspects of the environment, and the ticking gets worse under stress. Like OCD, Tourette's sufferers find it very difficult to stop these unwanted actions. And like OCD, Tourette's has been linked to the basal ganglia, a structure buried deep in the center of the brain that is important in habit learning. Because it has a strong biological component, drugs are often used to help with the symptoms. The tic of someone with Tourette's is like an extreme habit. Some of the most common tics are also very common social signals, like raising the eyebrows, nodding the head, or throwing up your arms in exasperation. Indeed, the tics may well be the result of what happens when social habits get out of control. Like regular habits, tics are often triggered unconsciously, may also be responses learned to particular situations, and like regular bad habits, sufferers are desperate to change them. The difference is that for those with Tourette's and OCD, the tics and habits they perform are often much more difficult to inhibit and are much more inconvenient in everyday life. Although serious sufferers of Tourette's and OCD often take medication, psychology can also help. One psychological intervention that is often used is habit reversal training. Although it's designed for people with Tourette's, there's much to learn from the procedure that therapists go through for anyone trying to change their habits. The first stage of habit reversal training is all about awareness of the tics themselves. People with Tourette's are asked to think about their tics, often with the help of a video of themselves. Then, they try to work out what internal or external factors might set off the tic. It could be something happening in the environment, like playing computer games, or it could be an internal thought or feeling, like thinking about Batman. The idea is that with greater awareness, there's more chance of being able to catch the tic building early in the sequence. In just the same way, thinking about and trying to notice our habits, both good and bad, is a great exercise for everybody. Even more crucial, though, is spotting the circumstances in which we perform our habits. Without knowing when they happen, it's difficult to make a change. Stage 2 is called competing response training. This is where tics are replaced with something else. So a bad habit is replaced with a less bad habit. For example, many people with Tourette's have the tic of jerking their head to one side. So instead, they learn the competing response of tensing their neck muscles. Alternatively, someone whose tic is sniffing will be encouraged to breathe deeply through their mouth. You might well ask why therapists don't try to replace it with nothing. Well, research suggests this doesn't work as well, and later on we'll discover a good reason why. The practical upshot of this therapy for changing habits is that we need to develop a competing response. Bad habits may be hard to change, but they can be sidestepped. That's why smokers chew gum. It's difficult to smoke and chew at the same time. Those two steps are at the heart of the therapy. First, notice the habit, then introduce a competing response. While these can start the change happening, they can't necessarily keep it going. For that, you need motivation, willpower, and the ability to stick at it. This is hard for all sorts of reasons, but this therapy gives us two vital starting points: noticing a habit to be changed and replacing it with another behavior. Despite the difficulties in changing extreme habits, there's evidence that habit reversal therapy can work for Tourette's sufferers. A randomized controlled trial led by John Piacentini from the University of California at Los Angeles recruited 126 children with moderate or severe tic problems and gave half the habit reversal therapy and the other half the regular supportive information and education. Just 18.5% of the control group were either improved or much improved after 10 weeks, while in the habit reversal therapy group, 52.5% were either improved or much improved. This shows that with a concerted effort, even extreme ingrained habits can be changed. But note that this is no quick or easy fix. Over the length of the study, children had a total of 10 hours with therapists along with help and support from their parents. Plus, 1/3 were also taking strong antipsychotic drugs. Fortunately, most of us aren't in an all-out war against our own biology. We're just battling old routines. Surely, if these children can successfully fight their disabling tics, we can manage much easier shifts in our own lifestyles. When we feel blue, the whole world looks blue, however it appeared yesterday. Bad moods color our perceptions, changing our experience and plunging us into pessimism and darkness. The next morning, though, for most of us, the world looks a better place. Where yesterday we saw only decay, ineptitude, and loss, today we see opportunity, success, and hope for the future. For some, though, the new dawn rarely comes. Every day, the world is still colored blue, and there seems little point in carrying on. There's a very simple question at the heart of depression. If bad things are happening to people all the time, why do only some people become depressed? In fact, some people seem to cope with all manner of bad things happening to them, and they quickly recover, while others go under at the slightest hiccup. The rest of us reside nearer the middle and take our slings and arrows as best we can. Like many simple questions, the answer is complicated and not fully mapped out. But clearly, it has a lot to do with the way we think. Depression isn't just, if at all, a biological disease of the brain. It is a way of thinking about what has happened to us and why. The processes that are at the heart of depression are, in many ways, a series of habitual thoughts. Here, we'll look at two that are most central to depression. The first problematic habit of thought in depression is to do with appraisal. Appraisal refers to the way in which we try to find meaning in the world. Human minds are meaning machines. We're always trying to work out why things are happening to us. The way that we routinely think about why things happen has a profound effect on our view of the world and how we experience it. Let's say, just for example, you lose your job tomorrow. After getting your resume in order, you start looking for a new job. But that proves difficult, so you are unemployed for a time. This is the kind of thing that is likely to make people depressed, and your habitual ways of thinking about this situation in part determines whether you'll actually get depressed. Let's say that you interpret losing your job in the following way. You think, on balance, that you lost your job because the economy is weak at the moment and your organization has been forced to cut staff. Although you've been unemployed for a while, there's a good chance that if you keep applying, you'll get something before long. You wouldn't be surprised to learn that this is a very non-depressive way of responding. The meanings you've attributed to the event are as follows. 1. It's not your fault you've lost your job. It's because of the economy. In other words, the cause is external. You didn't lose your job because you're no good at it. 2. The situation is temporary. You think the economy will recover. And 3. You have control over the situation. You think that if you keep trying, something will turn up. Now, these views of the world may or may not be objectively realistic, but what we're interested in is subjective reality, what it feels like to be you. For a person with a negative attributional style, a pessimistic habit of thought, the thinking would be the other way around. 1. It's my fault I lost my job. 2. I will never get another one, and 3, I can't do anything about it. It's pretty clear why thinking like this might make you feel hopeless. When you habitually think about negative events as though the causes are your fault, but also out of your control and will continue forever, then it's likely to lead to a depressive state of mind. Studies continue to support this idea that depression is at least partly a result of this habitual way of thinking. One large study assessed the thinking styles of 5,000 students and followed them up to over 2 years. From this sample, 173 students demonstrated this particularly pessimistic way of making sense of the world. Of these, 17% went on to have serious depressive episodes. In the remainder of the students, the rate was only 1%. If this attribution bias can help explain why some people get depressed, how can we explain why the rest of us don't? Life can certainly be depressing, but many of us only succumb to low moods for a while and then we recover. In other words, what habits of thought keep the rest of us mostly out of the woods? One very strong candidate is a mirror image to the negative attributional style, which is called the self-serving bias. We know that most of us use this habitual way of thinking because psychologists have seen the effects in decades of research. In these studies, people are asked things like, how charitable are you compared to other people? How kind are you compared to other people? And how lazy are you compared to other people? What we find is that people repeatedly rate themselves somewhat more highly than others around them. We tend to believe we are more charitable, cooperative, and kinder, while being less lazy, deceitful, or belligerent than other people. People display the self-serving bias in both their abstract traits as well as in their specific behavior. If you get people to predict whether they would help a stranger who had fallen in the street, they will tell you they are more likely to help than others. This can't be true, of course. We can't all be above average. Many of us are only average, and almost half of us, by definition, are below average. One piece of research has added together the results of 266 of these types of studies on the self-serving bias from all around the world. They found that the overall impact of the effect is large, meaning it's very easy to spot. The self-serving bias is also stronger in people from the Western world, and particularly from the US, than it is amongst Asian people. Nevertheless, overall, the habit of thinking positively about yourself in relation to other people is strong wherever you look, except in one place. People who are depressed don't tend to have a self-serving bias. In fact, they see themselves relatively accurately, which may well be part of the problem. That's not because depressed people are bad people, far from it. Just that the rest of us seem to need to see ourselves with rose-tinted glasses to get by. Another habitual way of thinking that seems to be important in depression is called rumination. Imagine I put you in a room, turn on some depressing music, say a little Radiohead or Barber's Adagio for strings, and then I get you to read a really depressing story. The story describes the unexpected and painful death of a loved one. This is one hell of a party. Afterwards, I get you to mull over the thoughts that are going through your head, really think about how you're feeling, the loss of a loved one and what it would mean. Are you having fun yet? This is exactly what researchers did in one early study. The ruminating group were compared with another group who did a distracting task afterwards designed to get their minds off the depressing music and story. You'll be unsurprised to learn that the people who were distracted were much more likely to recover quickly from the depressing story and the depressing music. This study was carried out on people who were not clinically depressed, but this habitual way of thinking is often seen in people who are depressed and anxious. In some ways, rumination looks like a good strategy for dealing with depressing things that have happened to you. People who use it frequently say they are trying to understand and solve their problems. The research shows that, in reality, rumination can interfere with problem solving rather than help it. This is partly because, as we've seen before, we have little access to our own unconscious. A along with many of the real reasons why we think and behave the way we do. Of course, ruminating and distracting yourself are not the only habitual ways of dealing with difficult circumstances in life. You could try and suppress the thoughts, or you could do your best to avoid them. One study has compared rumination with these strategies and others across 114 different studies and thousands of participants. They found that it's rumination that is most strongly associated with psychopathologies in general, including eating disorders, addiction, anxiety, and depression. However, while habitual ways of thinking are central to depression, anxiety, and other mental health problems, they can't explain everything. What they do is provide excellent examples of how habitual ways of thinking can either bog us down or, in the case of the self-serving bias, help pull us out of trouble. One of the most effective modern non-pharmacological treatments for depression and anxiety is cognitive behavioral therapy, known as CBT. At the heart of this type of therapy is the idea that both depression and anxiety can be alleviated by changing habits of thought. The therapy assumes that certain situations can repeatedly and automatically cue unhelpful negative thoughts. Here are some examples. 1. Black and white thinking, believing that if you don't achieve perfection at something, you're a failure. 2. Personalization, assuming that when bad things happen, it's all your fault, rather than just being bad luck or one of those things. And finally, 3. Catastrophizing, jumping straight to the worst possible case from relatively limited evidence. There are many more of these types of habitual thoughts which are common. Most of us think these things from time to time, but for people who are depressed, these thoughts have become overbearing and have started to take over their lives. When you jump to the worst possible conclusion with only the slightest provocation, life can be extremely depressing. Like cognitive therapy for people with Tourette's, CBT first asks people to try and identify these automatic negative thoughts. As we've seen, this is difficult because they can be automatic and unconscious, but with a trained therapist, it can be done. Then, CBT uses a process of questioning to see if the habitual thought is a reasonable one. People are asked to think back over their past experience and see whether the disastrous consequences they envisaged have happened before. Note that the goal of CBT is absolutely not about trying to think positive or put a thought out of mind. Avoiding a thought is very difficult. What CBT does is try to replace an unhelpful thought with something more helpful. It's trying to use the weight of the thought against itself, like a kind of mind judo. The same process is used to challenge core beliefs about the self. We saw that depressed people habitually attribute negative events to themselves, believe that they are out of their control, and think they'll never change. CBT also targets these core beliefs with similar tools. A therapist will try to examine how they came to such a negative view of the self, try to teach them to be more sympathetic towards themselves, and to feel some hope that change is possible. The problem is that these habitual ways of thinking have been ingrained over years and are very hard to change. They are also much closer to people's core personalities and so more painful to think about. Naturally, then, it can take a long time for someone who is convinced he is a failure to change his mind, even a little. For those of us who would like to change more modest patterns of thought, though, there is clearly hope. But even for less persistent habitual thoughts, the same challenges are likely to present themselves. Namely, 1. We are likely to be unaware of either some or all of our habitual thought processes, and 2. The habit will resist change because it is automatically cued by situations or other thoughts. The reason why we might want to change patterns of thought is simply that they aren't doing us any good. Just as it's easy for behavioral habits to hang around long after their purpose is forgotten, it's the same for ingrained ways of thinking. Many people have thought patterns that are long past their sell-by date, but which are stuck to out of pure routine. Take self-esteem as an example. People with low self-esteem have got into the habit of thinking about themselves as worth less than other people. This habit is likely to stem from childhood and has also likely been reinforced by others over the years. It may also be a self-fulfilling prophecy. A person acts as though he is worth less, and so is accorded lower status, which then reinforces his low self-worth. Breaking out of this kind of loop is difficult, but not impossible. It involves asking questions about why you think in a certain way and then trying to test these thoughts against reality. Are you really as worthless as you think? Certainly not. And it is also about addressing unhelpful core attributions such as thinking mistakes and failures are all your fault, will continue forever, and you can't change them. Not all habitual negative thoughts are bad and should be changed. Since psychologists are often faced with people suffering the depressing consequences of habitual negative thoughts, we know more about them than negative habitual thoughts that have neutral or even positive consequences. This may sound like a contradiction, but it's not, because negative habitual thoughts can have positive consequences. In fact, the dividing line between positive and negative outcomes can be thin. The simplest example is worrying. We've talked about worry in the guise of rumination and anxiety and their negative consequences, but worry can also be good for you. For example, studies have found that people who worry more perform better at work, are better at dealing with stressful events, and can do better at school. They may even be more healthy as a result of being more likely to engage in health-promoting behaviors. The reason for this is obvious when you think about it. People who worry about their performance at work are more likely to try and improve it, and the same goes for students' academic performance and health behaviors. So the question becomes about the type of worrying. Edward R. Watkins from the University of Exeter has suggested that one of the vital differences between constructive and unconstructive worrying is hidden in the character of thought. Let's imagine two ways of worrying. In the first, let's say you're worrying about your health. You've noticed some pain in your leg, and so you start to worry about it. This prompts you to think about other bodily problems and the general problem of the body's weakness. You wonder, abstractly, how long you have to live, and then, increasingly morbidly, how many people will come to your funeral. Meanwhile, the leg continues to hurt. Here's the second way. You start worrying about your leg, which prompts you to wonder if you've pulled a muscle while playing tennis. So you visit the doctor and get it looked at. This is a crude way to make the point, but notice that in the first example, the worry is abstract, whereas in the second, it's a concrete sort of problem-solving worry. Also notice where the abstract worrying ends up, assuming that a pain in the leg is the beginning of the end. This shows how small differences in the way habitual automatic thoughts are directed can strongly affect the outcome. Things tend to go better if worry prompts problem-solving than if it prompts existential crisis. For some people, though, life is one big existential crisis. The stereotype has been well mimed in comedy, with two of the best examples being characters created by Woody Allen and Larry David. These are people who manage to make their persistent negative thoughts work for them. So-called defensive pessimists put a lot of work into predicting how things will go wrong. They both set very low expectations about what will happen, and spend a lot of time thinking about the exact circumstances of their impending downfall. Defensive pessimists are like super worriers. Preparing for failure is not exactly a well-known strategy for success, but in the specific case of the defensive pessimist, it seems to work quite well. Like persistent worriers, defensive pessimists are motivated to problem-solve by their intuition that everything will go wrong. For people who are very pessimistic by nature, this strategy has been shown to work. Note, though, that the studies show that it doesn't work for people whose habitual thinking style is more neutral or optimistic. Still, this work does suggest that even super worriers, people with long-term persistent habitual negative thoughts, can benefit from a problem-solving habit of thought rather than focusing on abstract worry. When people think about bad habits, the first things that come to mind are potentially self-destructive behaviors like smoking, drinking, or gambling. Although habits of thought are not always as obvious for all to see, they can nevertheless have a huge effect on how we experience life. What we've seen in this chapter is that people who have OCD, Tourette syndrome, depression, and anxiety aren't as different from the normal population as we are often led to believe. The negative thoughts at the heart of these disorders are also regular parts of everyday life for most of us, although to a lesser extent. Negative thoughts aren't necessarily bad in themselves. Indeed, they're perfectly natural. It's all about whether or not they help us solve real-world problems or become useless obsessions that take over our mental lives. The fact that many habitual negative thoughts can have positive outcomes only reinforces how useful our habitual negative thoughts can be. Think of defensive pessimists. The treatments that have been developed suggest ways we can challenge negative thoughts that have become problematic for us. These focus first on identifying the problematic thoughts, no mean feat in itself, and then trying to adjust them. Cognitive therapies attempt to create this switch by re-examining the habitual thought in the light of our experience. We can ask ourselves whether our wildest fears are really founded, whether our aims are realistic, and whether our ways of interacting with the world could be improved. Of course, not all repetitive thoughts are negative. At the other end of the spectrum are positive habitual thoughts. We've looked at the self-serving bias as one manifestation of repetitive positive thinking. This is a habit of thought that helps us see ourselves and those we love in a more positive light. There are many other types of positive thought. For example, repeatedly thinking how lucky you are, letting your mind wander back to happy memories, and having pleasant daydreams. With practice, we can train ourselves to perform these happy habits regularly, so as to break out of a depressing loop and improve our everyday experience. Chapter 7. When Bad Habits Kill. On August 31, 1988, Delta Airlines Flight 1141, a regularly scheduled domestic flight, taxied for takeoff at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport. In the cockpit, it was business as usual as the last pre-flight checks were completed. Shortly before 9 a.m., the second officer called out a standard part of the checklist procedure: flaps, to which the first officer replied, 15:15 green light. These innocent-sounding 5 words, exchanged between first and second officer, are a vital part of the takeoff procedures. The wings of a large commercial passenger jet are designed for optimum efficiency when cruising at 40,000 feet. But during takeoff, they don't provide much lift. To help launch a 70-ton jetliner into the sky, the wings have to be larger. This is done by extending slats from the front of the wings and flaps from the back. In the Boeing 727 they were operating, the co-pilot does this by moving levers in the cockpit and checking that a green light comes on to confirm they are in position. Without flaps and slats correctly set, the plane may be drastically short of lift when the pilot pulls back on the control column. To observers on the ground, the takeoff didn't look right. Within seconds, the nose was pointing too high, and there were sparks coming from the rear of the plane. In the cockpit, the stick began to shake violently. This tells the pilot the plane is stalling. It's about to fall out of the sky. Ground observers saw the jet rolling from side to side, and on the cockpit voice recorder, the captain is heard to say, "We're not going to make it." The climb soon faltered, and 20 seconds after takeoff, the right wing hit an antenna, spinning the plane and sending it crashing back to the ground. In the impact and subsequent fire, of the 108 people on board, 14 were killed and 26 seriously injured. When the accident was investigated by the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, 2 major causes were identified. The flaps and slats had not been set to 15. In fact, they were at 0, which is for normal flight rather than for takeoff and landing. Also, there was a warning horn that should have sounded when the pilots tried to take off with the wings incorrectly configured. Unfortunately, this did not sound because it was broken. The reason they couldn't take off was simple enough. When the pilot pulled back, they didn't have enough lift. The question was, how such a regular pre-flight checklist, which had been successfully completed so many times, could have gone so tragically wrong. Many aspects of flying passenger jets are routine. Pilots have to get in the habit of performing all the necessary checks to ensure that their airplane is ready to take off. These habits are codified in checklists. There are checklists for all kinds of standard operations, but they are most important during the most dangerous phases of flight, landing and takeoff. These checklists are often long, and a short-haul pilot may have to go through them up to 10 times a day. In the Flight 1141 investigation, the focus was on the critical section where the second officer called out, "Flaps," and the first officer replied, 1515 green light. This was the correct checklist, and the response was also correct. If the first officer had really checked that the flaps and slats were set, the accident would not have happened. But the gap between the call-out and the reply was less than 1 second, which, the NTSB concluded, was hardly long enough to perform the relevant check. Could it be that flight deck habits designed to increase safety had become so automatic that it was ending up endangering safety? Subsequently, human interaction experts carried out interviews with pilots working at 7 major U.S. carriers. They found that because of the endless repetition, pilots quickly got into the habit of running through the checklists and, once practiced, did so automatically, often without really checking. Pilots reported that sometimes they only saw what they expected to see rather than what was really there. They got into the habit of seeing the control in the right setting so that even when it was wrong, their habitual perception of the situation overrode reality. When pilots went through the checklists, there was sometimes a sing-song quality to it. Instead of looking at the instruments and switches they were supposed to be checking, all of the replies were done from memory. This seemed to be what happened on Delta Airlines Flight 1141, which led to the mistaken conclusion that the plane was correctly configured for takeoff when, sadly, it wasn't. Accidents like this are far and away the exception and are getting rarer all the time. By and large, routine checklist procedures are what make air travel so safe. That, along with computer fail-safes to pick up pilot errors. Indeed, much of the research on checklists has been carried out in the airline industry because small routine mistakes can have such devastating consequences. In modern aircraft, checklists have now moved from paper to computer, with a corresponding reduction in errors made by pilots of almost 50%. Pilots don't just complete checklists for the aircraft, they also run checklists on themselves. The so-called I am safe checklist goes like this: illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue/food, and emotion. While it doesn't matter to other people that much if we're in a really bad mood at work, for a pilot, it could be deadly for everyone on board. The challenge for the airline industry is in standardizing habits and in working out why they fail when they do, because everyone's safety relies on it. The smallest slip has the potential to turn into a major disaster. For the majority of us, though, everyday slips in our habits seem less crucial. We continue to put on the same shoe first, visit the same coffee shop, and, at least some of the time, think the same thoughts. The reason that slips and mistakes in habits are so important is the same reason doctors have learned so much about the human body from the study of disease. They are opportunities to learn how the system works, should we so choose. Why do our habits operate some of the time, but fail us at other times? What is it that ensures the routine performance of a critical habit? The anatomy of a habit is revealed in the way it fails, perhaps more so than when it succeeds. On March 6, 1989, train driver Joseph McCafferty pulled out of Belgrove Station in Glasgow, Scotland, at 12:47 p.m. The train was a regular commuter service headed for Airdrie, a town 12 miles from Glasgow. He never made it. The train only traveled about half a mile before it plowed head-on into a train traveling in the opposite direction. The driver of the other train and a passenger were killed. Driver McCafferty had to be cut free from the wreckage and lost a leg in the accident. When the UK's Railway Inspectorate investigated, it emerged that Mr. McCafferty had pulled the train out of the station while the signal was at red, indicating that it wasn't safe to proceed. How had this happened? Sure, he was a young man of 22 when the accident happened. Yes, he had only been a fully fledged driver for about 5 months, but still he was fresh out of a good training program, which was deemed satisfactory by investigators. So what had gone wrong? The guard on driver McCafferty's train that day was Robert Bain, who had 9 years' experience in the job. It is the guard's responsibility to check that all the passengers are either on or off the train, and that the signal on the station indicates that it is safe for the train to proceed. He later admitted that he had not checked the signal, partly because it wasn't easy from his position at the back of the train, and he knew the driver would be able to see it clearly from the front. So, quite routinely, he gave the ready-to-start signal to the driver, which consists of 2 rings on a bell. The driver gave 2 bells in acknowledgement and started the train out of the station. He later told the inquiry that he thought the signal had been at green when he entered the station and didn't see any reason to check whether it had changed. The signalman, however, stated that the signal had never been at green and would have shown red during the whole time the driver would have been able to see it. Worse for the driver, even after pulling away, the red signal would then have been visible to him for another 13 or 14 seconds, but he still didn't notice it, being more concerned with the speed of the train. In the final report, McCafferty, the driver, got the majority of the blame for the accident, with the guard cited as a contributory factor. But ultimately, it is the driver's responsibility to check that it is safe to proceed, not the guard's. Psychologically, what had happened was that the driver had built up a simple habit. When he heard the ding-ding, he acknowledged it and set off without checking the signal himself. This type of accident was eventually tackled with a simple environmental change. A switch was put in the driver's cab called the Driver's Reminder Appliance. All it does is cut power to the train when it is activated. Drivers turn it on when they stop at a station as an extra safety check. If they get the ding-ding and try to apply power immediately, the train won't budge. They have to turn off the reminder switch, and this prompts them to check the signal first. Even better are systems which automatically stop the driver passing through a red signal by applying the brakes automatically. What happened to driver McCafferty and the Delta pilots was tragic, but also incredibly routine. They didn't involve very unusual circumstances or much that was out of the ordinary. Both were very basic mistakes with tragic consequences. In both cases, habits let people down, although in different ways. The pilots thought they had carried out a routine operation, checking the flaps and slats, which actually they hadn't, while the train driver had carried out a routine operation, pulling away from the station, but he'd done it at the wrong time, when the signal was at red. Psychologists call what happened to driver McCafferty a slip, when you carry out an action which you didn't intend. As he found out, whether habits are good or bad, under certain circumstances they are very difficult to avoid. Stress, in particular, drives us toward our usual, habitual response to a situation, even when we plan to do otherwise. The extent of this can be seen in a study where participants were asked to learn, on paper, routes through a fictional subway system. First, they practiced the routes for a time, building up the habit of how to travel from one place to the other, just as we do for any regular journey. Then, half were told the subway map would change and they would have to work out a new route. When participants were put under only mild time pressure, they only reverted to routine 30% of the time. But when the pressure was really put on, participants reverted to routine 70% of the time. Habits cause us all to slip up some of the time, although usually without serious consequences. The psychologist and usability engineer, Donald Norman, has examined thousands of human slips made in all sorts of circumstances. These include analysis of pilot errors, official government accident reports, as well as everyday slips in language. In one large class of slips, a habit is activated at the wrong time because it is brought to mind by something in the environment. William James, the 19th century American psychologist who wrote brilliantly about habits, described many of these sorts of everyday slips over a century ago. He wrote about a man going into his bedroom to dress for dinner, back in the days when people dressed for dinner, who got distracted and ended up getting into bed. Normal calls this a capture error, when the habit associated with a particular situation is so powerful that it overcomes all else. I'm in the bedroom. I've forgotten exactly why I came in here, so I might as well get ready for bed. These sorts of errors are so ubiquitous, I've just made one myself. Perhaps you heard it. At the end of the last paragraph, instead of writing Norman, I wrote normal. Normal is such a common word that it overrode Norman automatically. I only spotted it after rereading the paragraph. If you didn't spot it, well, that's also perfectly Norman. I'll stop now. That's because we also get into the habit of seeing what we expect to see rather than what's really there, just like the first officer on the tragic Delta Airlines flight. This has been tested in less dangerous circumstances by John Sloboda, an expert on the psychology of music. He has given musicians musical scores containing intentional mistakes and asked them to play from them. What he found was that the musicians correct many of the mistakes automatically by inferring the correct notes from experience. In the same study, he also found that people don't notice spelling mistakes, especially if they are in the middle of words. When it's on autopilot, the mind sees what it wants to see, or at least what it expects to see. Many routine slips have a comedic quality, and Donald Norman lists many everyday examples of the kind we've all made from time to time. One involves a person thinking about asking another to make more coffee, but forgetting to actually say anything. After noticing it hasn't arrived, they complain. It only then becomes obvious that the thought remained unspoken. This class of slips, when an action is substituted with only a thought, is clearly one of the most difficult to detect. We probably make these sorts of mistakes much more often than we know. A lot of the time, the consequences are so minor it makes no difference. We forget to pick up milk on the way home or charge up the laptop. In Norman's research, many slips were only detected with the help of an observer, and sometimes even then, neither actor nor observer noticed that mistakes were being made. Once again, in the psychology of mistakes, we see the unconscious nature of habits, making them difficult to control. Different types of amusing slip-ups also happen when habits get activated at the wrong time or are interrupted halfway through. James Reason, a psychologist and expert on human error, calls this the price of automation. He reports people trying to pour a second batch of boiling water into a teapot with no recollection of already having filled the pot, and people putting second cigarettes into their mouths without realizing they haven't lit the first one. Similarly, Donald Norman reports a story about a student who was in line at a salad bar with a $5 bill in hand. A few croutons fell off the plate onto the tray, and in the attempt to eat them, both hands came up at once, but the croutons ended up on the tray and the $5 bill in his mouth. These types of mistakes are most common when we're in familiar circumstances. We make them in our bathrooms, kitchens, bedrooms, offices, and so on. It's why we go to the bathroom intending to brush our teeth and end up brushing our hair. Or why we go to the fridge to get milk and end up with a glass of orange juice. It's not just that these are the places that we likely spend the most time. It's that these environments are chock full of cues for our habitual behaviors, just waiting to be activated as soon as we get distracted. The phrase health and safety now strikes fear into our hearts. It has picked up all sorts of negative connotations. We think of needless caution, killjoys, fluorescent jackets, and packets of peanuts which have written on the side, "May contain nuts." But behind this smokescreen of journalistic cliches are people trying to work out how to prevent accidental injuries and deaths. Until the 1970s, these kinds of people relied on what seems like a very sensible theory. They assumed that people would respond to education. For example, if you want people to wear helmets when riding motorbikes, you educate them. You tell them about brain injuries, compound fractures, wet roads, and blind spots, and then let them choose to wear helmets. Or if you want car drivers to wear seatbelts, you show them films of people being launched headfirst through their own windshields. Who wouldn't respond to these sorts of shock tactics? Well, it turns out quite a lot of people don't respond. In the UK, for example, from 1972, the government spent millions on ads about seatbelts on TV, radio, and billboards. It's estimated that 80 to 90% of British people saw these ads 8 or 9 times each. Still, after all this effort to change their behavior, only about 20 to 40% of people were wearing belts. The student of habits can tell you immediately that the educational method isn't going to work and why. We've seen that psychologists can change people's intentions, but this frequently fails to translate into any change in their behavior when faced by strong habits. It wasn't until the law was finally changed in 1983, along with strict policing, that people's behavior really shifted, with rates shooting up to around 90% or more. Around the 1970s, there was a quiet revolution in how we thought about preventing injuries. Some of the experts started to see that people didn't take much notice of attempts to educate them. In fact, they carried on doing exactly what they'd always been doing. They began developing models of injury prevention, which stressed the interaction of people with their environments. Instead of seeing us as completely autonomous, individual agents, separate from the environment, injury prevention experts started to see the web of situations we are caught in. We aren't just people walking around doing exactly what we want, driven only by our own motivations. We are embedded in our physical and social environment, partly responding automatically. It has been argued that our individual psychology and biology is just the tip of a metaphorical injury iceberg. These are the parts of the iceberg that sit above the waterline, the bits we can see. Then, below the waterline, are all the causes of accidents which aren't so obvious. Our homes, our workplaces, or the organization we're working for, our social class or other aspects of our community. At the deepest level is our place in society and our national psyche. Habits are a result of all these levels interacting. We do what we habitually do, not just for purely individual reasons, but because of this iceberg of interrelating and mostly hidden factors. What injury prevention experts began to notice was that their efforts couldn't just target the individual, they needed to target the environment. These shifts in thinking within injury prevention circles were mirrored in psychology. Through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the way many psychologists thought about behavior change was challenged. It emerged that getting people to stop smoking, do some exercise, or make any change at all was much harder than had been thought. The assumption that people could just will a change and it would happen was questioned. The models psychologists were using tended to be good at predicting how people behaved in one-shot situations, like when people in a lab are told about the health benefits of fruit and then given a choice between fruit or cake. But these models didn't work so well in the real world. Back in injury prevention, the buzz was all about changing contexts. If you could change the contexts in which people made decisions, then you had a better chance of changing their behavior, especially if that behavior was highly habitual. Like the effort to encourage people to wear seatbelts, only telling them that cigarettes were unhealthy did little to change their behavior. But when laws started to restrict where people could smoke, this had an effect. This was a change in the legal and therefore social environment, which was highly effective in getting people to change long-standing habits. Another environmental solution for regulating human behavior in dangerous situations is checklists. Although we've already seen how these can go wrong, their introduction did increase safety in aviation. Still, It has taken a long time because the change has had to reach down to the bottom of the injury iceberg, trying to influence the way pilots behave through their peer group, their training and education, even their very psyche. Unfortunately, the lessons learned from aviation have only spread so far. Product manufacturing is one area which knows all about the dangers of relying on human habits. Both food and automobile manufacturing have stringent monitoring procedures in place. Perhaps most enthusiastic in their use of checklists, though, are agencies which monitor the manufacture of medical devices and pharmaceuticals. One area ripe for colonization by checklists is healthcare, a point put forcefully by surgeon Atul Gawande in his excellent book, The Checklist Manifesto. Just as bad or poorly implemented habits can kill, so good and well-implemented habits can save lives. One study of the U.S. healthcare system has found that each year there are 1.5 million preventable injuries from medication errors alone. How many of these are related to habits is unknown, but studies have shown that checklists can help because people's habits can break down in pressurized situations, or simply through boredom. An Australian physician, Dr. Alan Wolfe, has found that the introduction of checklists at one hospital increased staff compliance with key medical procedures by up to 50%. Other studies have found they can improve patient safety in many areas, including anesthesiology and intensive care. These are just a few examples. There are many more. In some ways, this focus on the environment in injury prevention seems obvious, but we actually routinely make the same mistakes when thinking about ourselves. We think of ourselves as biology, psychology, and behavior, and neglect the deeper levels of ourselves, how we are embedded in our environments, both physical and social. Our habits, just like the other parts of our thinking and behavior, also grow out of these. The situation isn't just important for airline pilots, train drivers, or public health researchers. It's important for all of us battling against our everyday bad habits. The lesson that's been learned in all these fields is the same lesson we have to learn ourselves. The situation has more power to control our habits than we like to think. Chapter 8. Online all the time. We don't know her name, but her problem illustrates a new fear. According to the short case report in an academic journal, a 24-year-old woman presented herself to a psychiatric clinic in Athens, Greece. She had joined Facebook 8 months previously, and since then her life had taken a nosedive. She told doctors she had 400 online friends and spent 5 hours a day on her Facebook page. She recently lost her job as a waitress because she kept sneaking out to visit a nearby internet cafe. She wasn't sleeping properly and was feeling anxious. As though to underline the problem, during the clinical interview, she took out her mobile phone and tried to check her Facebook page. Is this the fate that awaits us all once the machines take over? Brains zapped into a robotic, unthinking, servile state by our online compulsions? Certainly many of us have already caught the internet bug. We know how useful it can be, and wonder how anyone lived before they had instant access to such a huge and transformative resource. In 10 years, we've moved from a situation where the internet was mostly the preserve of geeks and nerds to the current situation, where it is mainstream. At the same time, we are nervous about what the internet is doing to our minds. We worry about the increasing amount of time we spend using computing devices, whether laptops, phones, or tablets. We worry that the internet is making us lazy, destroying our ability to concentrate, and sucking up time we would otherwise be spending in the real world. We love the internet, but we also hate it. We want to use it, but we're sure we need time away from it. It's this ambivalence about our internet habits that draws so much interest. The internet's original killer application is, of course, email, that spam-spewing slave driver we love and hate in equal measure. Only a quick glance online reveals control over email checking habits is a widespread concern. Our email habits certainly produce some frightening statistics. How often do you check your email? It's probably more often than you think. One study has found that people set their email program to automatically check every 5 minutes, while an AOL survey reported that 59% of respondents check their email from the bathroom. That seems like taking multitasking to extremes. This habitual email checking may eat up as much as a quarter of our working day, maybe more. Perhaps part of the reason that people report email is so disruptive is that it can take over a minute to recover from the interruption and carry on with the task you were previously carrying out. Email is increasingly habit-forming because the way it arrives is similar to what behavioral psychologists call a variable interval reinforcement schedule. The variable interval refers to the fact that if you check your email every 5 minutes, then most of the time you won't get anything, and you don't know how long it will be until the next one arrives. The same is true of the emails themselves. Some are much more interesting and exciting than others. An email from your sister is likely to capture your attention more strongly than spam from an office supply company. What really needs explaining is why we check our emails so obsessively when so much of it is complete rubbish. Often it's spam or a boring email from the bank to tell us about a tiny change to the terms and conditions. Let's imagine a ridiculous situation to show why we keep checking. Let's say one interesting email is guaranteed to arrive each hour, on the hour. In this case, you would only check then. If one time the gossip or special offer too good to refuse didn't arrive, then you'd be sorely tempted not to bother checking again. And if there was still no juicy tittle-tattle or offer to become CEO of a major multinational a further hour later, you'd be even less likely to keep checking. When the expected schedule is off, we experience frustration, like when a train or bus fails to show at the appointed hour. That example sounds ridiculous because we know only too well how email really works. To see why email is so insidious, let's switch to a rat's eye view. There's the lever in front of him, which he presses, and out comes a pellet. Success! So, he hammers the lever a bit, but gets nothing for a while. Then suddenly gets two, one right after the other. Then, for a while, pellets are nowhere to be seen. Our experimental rat is getting a little frustrated, but he learns that you never know. You might get a pellet, or you might get nothing for ages. What happens is he learns to put up with the frustration and settles down into a relatively slow habit of pressing the lever. In the technical language of behavioral psychology, our rat is experiencing the partial reinforcement extinction effect. In other words, he is not that bothered about failing to get a pellet when he presses the lever because he's used to it. The same is true of the human emailer. We get used to not being rewarded for checking our email most of the time. What keeps us going is that one time in 50 when something really interesting comes through. This combination of learning to accept non-reward, along with occasional unexpected and unpredictable rewards, is partly what makes checking your email so habit-forming. There's a parallel here with looking for 3 cherries on a slot machine. Unlike email, though, which has a relatively random interval between rewards, slot machines pay out on a variable ratio interval. There's some standard time between payouts, and this is varied a bit. The gambler then knows the machine will spew out coins at reasonably regular intervals, but isn't quite sure when. Although, of course, it will always take more of your money on average than it gives back. Casinos know from experience that this type of variable ratio interval is extremely powerful and will keep gamblers feeding in coins hour after hour. If you think you're addicted to email already, just be thankful the gambling industry wasn't involved, or you'd never look away from the screen. Still, the email checking habit is incredibly difficult to change, partly because it's so easy to perform, and, like many other habits, we do it almost without thinking. For some people, it's like a nervous tick or a time filler in between other activities. These habits may irritate us, but they're not that damaging. The danger comes when checking our email starts to affect work or interrupt other more enjoyable activities. When you go away on vacation, the temptation to check work email can be huge. You resist a few times, but the idea keeps popping into your head that something might need attending to. And because you're on a regular schedule of email checking, you are soon on your phone or laptop without thinking. In the back of your mind, you know it's a bad idea because you'll ruin the holiday feeling thinking about work. But the habit is often so strong, it takes over. For most of us, the biggest problem is the torrent of work email. Researchers have interviewed people in different professions about their strategies for dealing with email. 3 broad categories emerged. And the first were scheduled emailers. In this category, participants reported that they scheduled their email checking and kept it to once or twice a day, but no more. These participants were determined that email shouldn't rule their lives. In the second category were the obsessive emailers. One participant checked his email every 30 seconds and always responded immediately to everyone that came in. Others freely admitted they checked their email way too often, constantly using it for both work and family matters, and many feared their mailbox would get too big. The last category were the deleters. These people simply deleted messages that were from strangers or people they didn't want to hear from. Well, that's one way of dealing with it. For those of us who have large quantities of email to get through at work, the aim is to become a scheduled checker, but where the schedule is a lot less than every 30 seconds. It will depend on how long you are able to concentrate on a particular task, but every 45 minutes is a reasonable compromise. The idea being that after 45 minutes spent concentrating on a task, it's about time for a break. Any attempt to change established habits has to take into account the situation. We're not rats running around cages, pressing levers. We're human beings with a broad range of choices. There are alternatives to checking your email, like resting your eyes or making a hot drink, but these are not so frequently and insidiously reinforced as exciting emails. If we want to change our email checking habit, the research suggests that it needs to be replaced with another type of behavior that is more attractive. In the language of behavioral psychology, we need to reinforce a different behavior. Instead of checking email, we could give ourselves a 30-second screen break. For people who sit in front of monitors all day long, allowing the eyes to relax is a much better use of time than checking email. Plus, this space can be used to reflect on what you're working on. If this doesn't work, then why not try a standard strategy from behavioral psychology? Punishment. But since you probably don't want to rig your mouse to give an electric shock when you try to check your email, we'll have to use the higher faculties of reason and understanding. First, consider the dangers of multitasking. Although it may feel like we are able to do 2 tasks at once, say talking on the phone and checking our email, what's actually happening is that our brain is quickly switching from one task to the other. Unfortunately, switching between tasks has costs. Most notably, we are likely to forget what we are doing. Our intentions are surprisingly fragile, despite the feeling that we could never forget them. A delay as short as 10 or 15 seconds, the time it might take to read an email, is enough to put us off track. When we come back from an email, it takes time to remember what we were doing, or we may not remember it at all. There are varying figures for how long it takes to recover from an email, but one study suggests 64 seconds. Another study suggests people spend as little as 3 minutes on each task before they switch to another. Not all of these switches are caused by email, but many were. And at each switch there is a similar cost to concentration and to the psychological state of flow, that feeling of being in the zone in which we often do our best work. Nowadays, email is ancient history, and the buzz is all about social media. Twitter, in particular, has captured people's attention. Twitter is a cross between a social network and a blog. The blog part is that users read and write 140-character tweets, which are largely public. The social network part is that people follow each other, then become part of each other's Twitter conversations. They can also retweet or retransmit other people's messages to their own followers. Although we are often encouraged to think of services like Twitter as brand new, bleeding-edge technologies, the fascinating thing about social media is that conceptually, there's hardly anything new about it. When you send a tweet, it's like sending an email, except on Twitter it's limited to 140 characters and you CC all your followers and effectively the whole internet. Behind the hype, we are still sitting in front of our computers or using our mobile phones to communicate information to other people. Using Twitter, though, has the potential to be more immersive than email. With email, you generally have one conversation at a time. On Twitter, you can be carrying out many conversations all at the same time. Email is reminiscent of letter writing, while Twitter is more like going to a virtual party. Messages from all the people that you follow scroll up the screen, and you add your own messages to a huge public conversation. The social aspects of Twitter, though, shouldn't be overstated. Everyone isn't talking to each other equally. Just like at a party, some people talk louder and longer, and a lot of people only talk about themselves. In one piece of research which analyzed over 350 Twitter users, only 20% shared information with other users and replied to them. This group were dubbed informers. On the other hand, 80% only broadcast information about themselves to their followers. They were dubbed me-formers. The me-formers tended to have smaller social networks, perhaps because they were less likely to pass on pieces of information that would be of general interest and would give a hit of pleasure to their followers. More evidence that Twitter usage is lopsided comes from a study of 300,542 users in 2009. This found that just 10% of the users generated 90% of the tweets. Many of the most popular tweeters were, unsurprisingly, celebrities. The other 90% sent out little or nothing. The median number of tweets over the full lifetime of the account was exactly 1. In other words, most people probably only sent out their first tweet, if that, when they joined and then never posted another message. Since that 2009 study, it is possible that people are already posting to Twitter more than they used to. Still, it is likely that while the average user's usage will pick up, the overall pattern will remain the same, with the vast majority of users listening attentively to a minority. Although people expect the social elements of Twitter to be most gratifying, in reality, when they start using it, the informational aspects are the ones that prove most satisfying. Most Twitter users think of it more as a useful information source than as a social network. An analysis of the networks and paths of tweets that travel between people supports this, with less than a quarter of Twitter users having reciprocal links between them. This is where the analogy of a party starts to break down. Even the quietest and most withdrawn partygoers say hello to the host when they arrive and manage to chat with a few people. Twitter doesn't seem to be like that. The average Twitter user is mainly waiting and hoping for a new piece of juicy information to come through. This is where Twitter and emails are similar. For many people, it's more fun to receive an interesting email than it is to write one. Like email on Twitter, an interesting tweet could arrive at any moment, but you don't know when. You could get a batch of interesting tweets one after the other, or nothing for a few hours. Once again, it's a variable interval reinforcer in which users get used to the frustration of not getting anything interesting for a while, but keep checking anyway. People join Twitter for all sorts of reasons. Their friends are on it, they've heard about it in the media, or want to follow a celebrity. In some ways, the reason doesn't matter. If people derive some satisfaction or gratification from it early on, then a habit soon starts to form. With habit comes the automatic, unconscious compulsion to check Twitter. What we see in Twitter usage is what we see in many other types of habits. At first, we decide on our actions deliberately and for specific reasons. Once the habit has established itself, our conscious thought processes fade into the background, and Twitter use becomes self-sustaining. We check email because we check email, and we check Twitter because we check Twitter. It's then up to the conscious, rational parts of our minds to check up on these habits every now and then, and ask ourselves whether we are still getting something out of the behavior or whether it needs reining in. We've looked at both email and Twitter as two examples of how our online habits operate. Email because it is the Internet's original killer application, and Twitter because it is one of the new kids on the block, and very popular. But really, they're just different forms of media, ways of storing and delivering information. It just so happens that many of the media which are currently so fashionable are accessed through the Internet. The Internet is special and new in some ways, but in others, it's just performing the same function as printing presses and radio waves and TV signals. It propagates information. And wherever there is information being propagated, there will be people building up media habits. Take television as an example of an old-school media. Here's a simple question. Why do you watch TV? Many people's answer to this question has something to do with uses and gratifications. You get something from it, whether it's entertainment, education, or information. But lurking in the back of your mind is another suspicion. A suspicion that this book is hopefully doing something to cultivate. Perhaps watching TV has more to do with habit and passing the time than anything you actually get from it. Admittedly, passing the time is a kind of use, but not a very good one. It's the kind of explanation we give when we don't really know why we're doing something. For decades, researchers have supported the idea of people as mostly consciously choosing how much they watch television and what they watch. But this view has been attacked by some who find evidence that our habits win out over our intentions. We have a tendency to resist this explanation because it threatens our sense of being in control of ourselves. How dare psychologists tell me I don't know why I'm watching TV? But since people have relatively little insight into their internal cognitive processes, they can easily make up explanations for their habitual behavior. None of this is to say that some television doesn't entertain, inform, and educate. Clearly, some of it does. The point is that, like email and Twitter, what once provided us with gratification can easily become a mindless, automatic process, which we explain away to ourselves with reasons that are long out of date. The key is to notice these habits, bring the decision back into the conscious mind, and try to spot when it's time to switch off. Finally, we reach a word that may have been in the back of your mind throughout: addiction. If you can't stop checking your email account or Twitter feed, or indeed can't stop watching reruns of Scrubs, then are you addicted? Can a bad habit like this spiral out of control into an addiction? Addiction is an emotive word, and there is a huge debate going on about whether we can say some people are addicted to the Internet. Some say it is impossible to be addicted to the Internet because it is a medium of communication. For example, someone may spend hours online every day trying to find the cheapest price for vodka, but you'd be hard-pressed to argue they were an Internet addict rather than an alcoholic. This argument is true but misses the main point. Whether or not people can really be said to be addicted to the Internet, there are certainly bad habits to be explained. It's easy to be unaware of just how much we check our email or log on to Twitter. Switching from writing an important report to check email or Twitter doesn't feel like it interferes with report writing. Instead, we rationalize it as a break. But it may actually be a robotic, habitual behavior that serves no purpose, not even giving us any pleasure. Rather than talking about addiction, though, some psychologists have suggested that we should think about deficient self-regulation. We are out of control. There are two aspects to problems with self-regulation. The first is deficient self-observation, we don't notice how much time and energy we are putting into online activities. Second is deficient self-reaction. We don't seem to have control. Each feeds into the other, making it less likely that we'll be able to make a change. Whatever it's called, in the most extreme cases, people do seem to be using the internet in a way that looks like an addiction. Addicts become heavily preoccupied with it, getting arousal while using it and experiencing cravings for it while away. They find they need to use it more and more to get the same effect. They start to lose control of their habit and feel withdrawal symptoms when away from it. The habit starts to eat away at other activities, close relationships, work, and anything approaching a normal life. Performing the habit becomes a method of escape. At the same time, addicts try to conceal their addiction from others. While these problems do exist, it is likely they've been overstated in the population as a whole. Much of what we know about how people use the internet has come from studies in which the participants are already high users of the internet, such as the kind of people who respond to online adverts for study participants. Some have found that 80% of participants are dependent on the internet, spending an average of 38.5 hours on it a week. But this is a bit like judging how much alcohol people drink on average by heading to a bar at happy hour. When you extrapolate from people who are deeply immersed in the internet, it does look like the machines are in control. When you recruit people across a range of social classes and age groups, you get a much less frightening answer. One Swedish study from 2011 surveyed over 1,000 people and found that the weekly average amount of time spent on the internet at home was 10 hours. The vast majority of people in that study didn't use the internet excessively, with only 5% using it more than 30 hours a week. Regular media habits don't become really bad media habits or addictions without some help. Often, depression or anxiety is involved. For those experiencing these states, being online starts as a pleasant distraction from everyday worries, but can soon become a problem of its own. What can happen is that going online becomes an habitual reaction to feeling depressed, anxious, or experiencing some other aversive state. Once the linkage between emotional state and habitual response is established, it can be remarkably difficult to break down. It's a vicious circle, because depression leads to bad media habits, which leads to negative life events, which then leads back to more bad media habits. It's like the Greek woman in the case report at the start of the chapter. Her Facebook use meant she lost her job, which led to more time on Facebook. The stronger the habit gets, the worse life gets, and so the more attractive it becomes to escape into the screen. This talk of addiction might seem a bit much if all you're worrying about is checking your email or Twitter feed too often. And of course, for the vast majority of people, these symptoms will never be experienced to these extreme levels. But for anyone who's ever felt some aspects of online activity start to take over their lives, a few of these symptoms will be familiar. People talk about withdrawal when away from their email, checking it secretly, and feeling ashamed. At the extreme, it can push out other activities and feel like it's getting out of control. These behaviors can easily continue at work, where the fairly normal activity of cyber slacking, shopping, gaming, or blogging on company time, can quickly turn into cyber absenteeism. A survey of office workers has found that they spend an hour each day on non-work-related activities, of which almost half were online. This is probably a conservative estimate, which would increase dramatically if the internet logs were examined. The fact that so many of us are sitting in front of computers all day at work and then again in the evening, and on internet-enabled mobile phones in between, means the opportunity is always there for our online habits to get out of control. Email and Twitter are great examples of how popular online activities can be habit-forming. But these same mechanisms and processes operate in other online and offline media to greater or lesser degrees. For example, online gaming may be more addictive than Twitter, Facebook, or any other social network, but the experience can hook users for just the same reasons. Games reward us with the pleasure of finishing off the bad guy, solving a puzzle, or getting to the end of the level, while Twitter, Facebook, TV, and the rest reward us with little bits of information, social connections, and entertainment. The reason we're online all the time is that the rewards for certain online behaviors are so easy to learn. You don't have to move from your chair. Everything comes to you. Because the association is so clear and obvious and happens so quickly, like the rat getting its pellet of food, the habit is easy to learn. As a result, it's not surprising that computers, phones, and other electronic devices are super habit-forming in the way that previous non-interactive media weren't. They react instantly and often attractively to what we do. Watch other people tapping away at their mobiles or clicking on their mice. And what do they look like? Rats hitting a lever for a pellet? In many ways, that's what we are. Finally, it's the sheer ubiquity of the internet that makes the services we can access through it so habit-forming. Our online activities easily permeate almost all aspects of our lives. Potentially, we can be online without any effort from the moment we wake up in the morning to the second we go to sleep. A tablet computer is by the bed, along with internet-enabled mobile phone. At work, many of us are permanently online. In the evening, while watching TV, Google will tell us the actors' heights and ages. While cooking, we can check Twitter. While falling asleep, we can listen to internet radio. Technology is creating a world where people can and do fill up every moment of time with online activities of one kind or another. Our online habits can be layered one on top of the other so that there is no time for anything else. Studies of the way young people interact with computers show they very rarely do only one thing at a time. More normally, teenagers are to be found watching TV, instant messaging, surfing the internet, and downloading music, all at the same time. The debate continues about what harm our online habits might be doing to us. Some studies suggest that heavy multitasking habits may make us less able to concentrate on one task and perform it properly. But the research is at such an early stage, it's difficult to draw any solid conclusions. What we can say is that, like any technological advance, the internet is not inherently good or bad in itself. It's how we learn to use it that matters. With all the advantages being online gives us, we are also offered a set of potential dangers we have to understand. What we know about how humans react to virtual environments is still in its infancy. But we can be sure we will be offered up new online services tailor-made to engage our habits. In the battle between intention and habit, we need to be able to work out who is winning, who is master, and who is slave.